Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who wish to do so, please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. said he had too much else on his plate. It didn't need filling. we've got someone from his precinct, and we've got almost 30 members. So Nancy Heller, she's at precinct 8. Okay. Hi. Okay. All right. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a quorum. Would you take your seats, please, as soon as possible? The town clerk advises me that we have a quorum this evening, and I call to order the fall town meeting. I acknowledge the clerk's certification of the publication and proper service of the warrant, and in the absence of Estelle Cates, Jesse Mermel has kindly agreed to lead us in the Star-Spangled Banner.
A poor man's Estelle Cates. If you didn't already wish that she was getting better, you will after this. And everyone, please feel free to help me out and sing along. Thank you, Tommy. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Ms. Mermel. That was a noble effort. I have a few announcements before we start our proceedings. There is a handout at the checkers tables relating to Veterans Day, and if you haven't picked up a copy, please do so. I ask you at this point to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Reminder of our seating procedures. Only town meeting members forward of the checkers, except the front row center, is reserved for speakers and town staff. First two rows on my right are reserved for members of the press, and handicapped town meeting members may sit anywhere in the front row, of course. I remind all speakers to, as your first piece of business, to announce your name and precinct. And except as I announce otherwise, all speakers are limited to 5 minutes. I remind you to address your questions to the moderator and not to anyone else in the auditorium. I've been asked to say a couple of words about conflict of interest matters. If you're speaking to town meeting and you have a financial interest of some manner in the subject on which you are addressing town meeting, that must be disclosed. A financial interest is more acute than simply being a Brookline taxpayer, but you should err on the safe side in deciding whether to disclose your interest or your relationship to the a petitioner or the subject matter as attorney or an accountant or some such relationship such as that. Keep this in mind. It doesn't happen very often, but and there are no legal penalties for not disclosing an interest, except that except the embarrassment that you may suffer by being outed by the moderator or someone else. We will take the articles in the order in which they appear in the warrant this evening. And before we start the articles, I want to say a few words about our new electronic voting system, and we will have a couple of test votes, both to test the equipment with which you've been furnished and to test your ability to follow instructions. The electronic voting is really the result of a process that began 10 years ago in 2002 when we had our first moderators committee that studied alternative voting methods. And the electronic voting was first considered by a second moderators committee several years thereafter, and the main inhibiting factor at that point was the cost. Well, as is the case with most new technologies, the cost of these systems has been reduced dramatically over the years, and it enabled us for less than $20,000 to become equipped with the necessary hardware and software to implement electronic voting. There are 3 circumstances under which we will vote electronically. The first is if the moderator is in doubt as to a hand count, we will have an electronic count. If there are 7 town meeting members who question a result announced by the moderator, other than a result of an electronic vote, we will have an electronic vote. And the purpose of either of those is solely to get an accurate count. The third method is by the usual rule that if 35 town meeting members request an electronic vote, we will have one, and that will be a recorded vote, and the results of that vote will be maintained by the town clerk's office for 3 years and will be available very soon after it's taken if you're online, which of course you shouldn't be. You should be paying attention to proceedings instead of fiddling with your computer. When the first thing that needs to happen is that I need to make clear to you when we have a call for an electronic vote, I need to make clear to you exactly what you're voting on, and that's really my responsibility. I will inform the voting coordinator on my right, who is Dave Marquardo from the town IT department, and he will properly entitle the screens that will show the results of the voting. When it's time for a vote, I will call for Dave to start the timer, and we will have a 40-second period during which you can vote. During that period, I will first call for those who are in favor of the motion before you to stand and press 1 on your handheld device, which is a yes vote. I will then ask you to be seated. I will then ask those voting against the proposition to stand and press 2. And then I will ask them to be seated, and the 40-second period will then run its course. Notwithstanding my asking you to stand and vote, you can press your choice at any time during the 40-second voting period. The last button that you press during the voting period is the vote that will be recorded for you. There are only 3 of these numbers that are effective means of voting: 1, 2, and 3. 1 is a yes, 2 is no, and 3 is abstain. At the end of the 40-second period, we will close the voting, and during the voting period and for 15 or 20 seconds thereafter, there will be a series of screens that will scroll through on the screen behind me that will show how your vote has been recorded. I think you will very quickly learn to see where your name is and to make sure that your vote has been properly recorded. We'll scroll through 5 screens a total of 2 times. So you can have 2 chances to see that your vote has been properly recorded. As the votes as you select your votes, the total will also be recorded on the screen behind me. At the end of the voting period, we will deal with anybody who believes that their vote has been improperly recorded, and hopefully we'll have very little of that. Anyone whose device does not work can exchange it for one that does with the voting coordinator up here on the stage. All of the devices have had their batteries checked, so that should not be a problem. But in the world of technology, anything can go wrong at any time, and the laws are that it's likely that things will go wrong. In any case, we're going to take a couple of test votes, and just so that you get more comfortable with this means of voting. So I'm going to give you a proposition, a resolution, on which you will then vote electronically. The resolution is resolved that the re-election of President Obama will benefit our country. And you can start the voting period. Whenever you're ready. Okay. Those who vote in favor of that resolution, please stand and press 1. You need not point your device in any particular direction. Those, you may be seated, and those opposed to the proposition, please stand and press 2. Thank you. You may be seated. You can see that the total has been recorded. You can again change your vote at any time in the next 3 seconds. 2, 1, and now the voting period is over. And the resolution passes by a vote of 158 in favor, 7 against, and 11 abstentions. Now, was everyone's vote properly recorded, or is anyone's vote improperly recorded? Okay, you can stop the scrolling. Well, so far so good. Okay. If your vote is properly transmitted and recorded, this little red screen will light up. So if the first thing to try, if your vote seemingly has not been recorded, is to press harder. Any questions so far? If you have any questions at any time, you can come to a microphone.
Missing name.
Sorry?
Missing name. Jenny Smith, Precinct 4. We didn't see it. Okay.
Yeah. I think so.
Virginia Smith is on the list, and she has keypad number 58, so check the number of your keypad. Thank you. Mr. Rosenthal?
Yeah, Marty Rosenthal, Precinct 9. I wonder if you'd indulge people like me and John Bassett that failed to get recorded and try one more time before the meeting starts?
Yeah, we're going to have another test vote.
Oh, okay. Then I failed to hear that as well. So.
And the vote on the Obama presidency was not a recorded vote. So, Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis?
Thank you. Is there any way of...
Who are you?
Jonathan Davis, Precinct 10. Is there any way of increasing the size of what's displayed on the screen?
We're sorry. Those of you who have weak eyes should sit toward the front of the auditorium. I'm sorry, but we've... I should give credit, by the way, while we're going through the practice runs, to the Ad Hoc Moderators Committee, which I appointed early this year, and that shepherded the whole process of helping to select the vendor and working out the procedures that are now embedded in the town meeting handbook. That committee consisted of Kevin Stokes, the IT director, Pat Ward, the town clerk, Neil Wyshynski of the advisory committee, Stanley Spiegel of the advisory committee, Joel Schoner from the League of Women Voters, and Bob Stein, former chairman of the Board of Selectmen, and a techie. Okay, we'll try one more vote. This is another resolution. Resolved that the New England Patriots deserve to win the Super Bowl. When you're ready to start. Okay. Okay, you can start the time. So those in favor of the resolution, please stand and press 1. Thank you. Those opposed, please stand and press 2. And those of you who are abstaining can press 3 at any time. The voting period is over, and the motion carries narrowly by a vote of 67 in favor, 63 against, and 57 abstentions. And I did forget to mention that the purpose of having you stand and cast your votes is to some extent to preserve the traditions of counted votes in town meeting. It's a little awkward, I realize, but and it's not necessarily cast in stone, but the committee thought it was a good, moderators committee thought it was a good idea. Okay, thank you very much. I think we will, unless there are any questions about the process, we will proceed to Article 1. Yes, I've been asked to clarify one thing. The voting keys are numbered 1, 2, and 3. They're not these first 3 keys at the top just below the display. They're the numbered 1, 2, and 3, first row. I mean, I'm sorry, the top row of the numbered keys. Won't do you a bit of good to press whatever those top 3 keys are with the dashes. Okay, we're ready to proceed with Article 1. The motion under Article 1 is at the bottom of page 1-1. It's moved by Ms. DeWitt, seconded by Mr. Franco, to authorize the payment of certain unpaid bills of prior years. Ms. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Betsy DeWitt, speaking for the Board of Selectmen. It is the state statutes that provide that unpaid bills from previous years may not be paid from the current year's appropriations without the specific approval of town meeting. Both the police and fire departments have unpaid telephone, well, actually Verizon bills, they're not exactly telephone bills. While quite old, the Public Safety Business Office has explained to the selectmen that they are legitimate bills and that they occurred during a transition in the accounting system and are our obligations and need to be paid. There was confusion on both the town's part and Verizon's as to the proper billing attribution, which is why the bills were not paid. The selectmen and the finance department have reviewed the bills and verified that they are a valid obligation of the town. Therefore, the Board of Selectmen agrees with the advisory committee and unanimously recommends favorable action on the 2 votes on page 1-1 of the combined reports.
Thank you, Mr. Franco. Mr. Franco has nothing to add. All those in favor of the 2 votes at the bottom of page 1-1, please say aye. Those opposed, motion carries unanimously, which is fortunate because it requires a 9/10 vote. Article 2. Article 2 relates to the collective bargaining agreements. There are no such agreements before you this evening, and the motion is for no action made by Mr. Bors and seconded by Ms. DeWitt. All in favor of no action under Article 2, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Article 3. The motion under Article 3 is at the bottom of page 1 of the yellow supplement over to the top of page 2 and includes the charts from the financial charts on the yellow pages. Moved by Dr. Kuchar and seconded by Ms. DeWitt that the town amend the FY 2013 budget as shown in the tables, and secondly, that the town appropriate the sum of $1,750,000 for the purpose of paying the costs of a feasibility study and schematic design relating to the Devotion School. Dr. Kuchar.
Jerry Kuchar, Precinct 16, speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee, I believe, is in substantial agreement with the Board of Selectmen on this item. There are 3 transfers in the main budget, one from line 12, where a savings of $22,500 was recognized in the personnel budget. This came about because of an agreement on group insurance where the town was able to negotiate the opportunity for employees who wish to buy supplemental life insurance. And as a result, premiums were held level for the current and next 2 fiscal years at a savings of $22,500. Then you'll notice that on line 22, that same $22,500 is recommended for transfer to what's called the, it came out of line 22, which was the savings and employee benefits, and it went into line 12, which is the public works budget. It would go to pay for a part-time staff member to assist in the implementation of the taxi medallion program. If this person proves to be necessary beyond the current FY, it would be proposed in the next year's FY budget. You then see a proposed change of $430,222. This is as a result of increased state aid, is recommended to be assigned to the school budget. And as most of you know, the school budget had a dramatically increased kindergarten enrollment this year over what was expended, and this state aid is supposedly dedicated to the school budget in any case, so we're recommending transfer there. When you go down to the next item, you see the proposal to raise and appropriate $1,750,000 for the purpose of the feasibility study initial levels on the Devotion School project. This is being proposed at this time in order to have the work done in a timely manner so as to qualify for potential state reimbursement. And the advisory committee recommends favorable action on that. Initially, we had also recommended an appropriation, raising and appropriating $200,000 to pay for parking meter replacements with the area meters that proved unpopular to be replaced with individual parking space meters. We, as a cautionary step, inserted that thanks to the negotiation of town employees on the contract. It turns out that we were able to sell the old area meters for a substantial amount of money, making the net difference between what we had to lay out for the new meters and what we made on the old meters to be an amount that does not require an appropriation. Hence, that $200,000 is no longer requested. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. DeWitt. And Mr. Morse, would you please come forward and sit in the front row?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Betsy DeWitt, speaking for the Board of Selectmen. As Mr. Kuchar mentioned, there are both operating and capital budget amendments before us under Article 3. We are fortunate to have $800,000 available for allocation. The amount comes from three sources. First, local aid. In the final state budget signed by the governor, Brookline received $430,222 more in net local aid than we voted at town meeting in May. Second, in group health, since the town has joined the Group Insurance Commission, it has experienced lower rate increases. This year, we put 5% increase as a projection in the financial plan, but fortunately, the rate came in at a 2% increase, resulting in a savings of about $850,000 divided between town and school budgets. The school share was appropriated in May of about $450,000, but we held the town's share of about $350,000 in reserve against budget uncertainties. And the third item was life insurance. The town was able to negotiate a favorable 3-year rate lock that resulted in a reduction of $20,000. We are in agreement with the advisory committee as to the allocations. In the school budget, in order to support the substantial increases in school enrollment over projections, the town's school formula for sharing costs has been modified this fiscal year to add a factor for enrollment growth. This September, there were 100 more kindergarten students than had been anticipated in January of 2012, meaning a possible 5 additional classroom sections. And therefore, we recommend that the additional local aid of $430,222 be added to the school budget. In the pension fund, it's not surprising to learn that over the last several years, the fund has not earned its assumed rate of return of 8.15% that's used to calculate the annual contribution. In fact, in 2011, the fund lost 1.4%. A more prudent, lower assumed long-term return rate of 7.75% has been built into the formula going forward. However, the combination of not making the assumed rate of return and the increase in annual contribution reducing the estimate, our estimate going forward will require an increase in our annual contribution. And therefore, we are recommending that the group health savings of $344,222 $283 be added to the fiscal 13 pension fund appropriation. This is to mitigate the impact of the lower investment returns and to reduce the amount needed in FY14. And finally, we recommend the modest increase of $22,500 to the DPW Transportation Division to hire staff in January 2013 to help implement the move to a taxi medallion system, which was supported by town meeting vote in 2008, and it was passed in special legislation in 2010. The transition to medallions will require preparing procurement and contract documents. In addition, there will be ongoing enforcement of the new regulations. The position will be funded fully in the FY14 budget. This amount will come from the group health, group life reductions. And in addition, there are two capital projects. First, the Devotion School. After several years of school department planning, this March, the Massachusetts School Building Authority declared that the Devotion School project is eligible to be considered for matching state funds. The town has formed a school building committee and has completed the SBA initial compliance requirements. The next step in the process is to fund a feasibility study and schematic design phase, and this has to happen within 270 days after the eligibility notification. The proposed appropriation before us must be approved at this town meeting in order to meet the deadline. If it is approved, the next actions will be to hire an owner's project manager and then to hire an architectural firm for feasibility and schematic design in the spring of 2013. Therefore, we recommend the appropriation of $1.75 million to come from the overlay surplus in order for the Devotion renovations to proceed without delay. And finally, yes, we heard you on parking meters. The town is in the process of replacing the multi-space meters at curbside with smart single-space meters that will accept credit cards. To do this, we had to buy 405 new meters at a cost of $216,675. Some multi-space machines are being moved to the parking lots to reduce the queues. The remaining surplus can be sold or traded in. The town has successfully negotiated to trade in 49 surplus machines with a vendor for $202,125. The additional $14,550 to purchase the new meters, plus a $40,000 cost for installation and to program the new meters, will be covered by the $100,000 previously appropriated by town meeting for parking meter conversion, and therefore the $200,000 item listed in the combined reports is not required. We believe these amendments are timely and prudent, and the Board of Selectmen unanimously recommends favorable action on the vote and the amendments in tables 1 and 2 of the yellow supplement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morse.
Good evening. My name is Alan Morse, and I'm privileged to be the current chairman of your school committee. I reside in Precinct 3. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for permitting me to speak this evening. I will address the ongoing extraordinary growth of our school district's student body over the last 8 years, this being the reason for both of Article 3's funding requests. Our growth is primarily the result of increases in our kindergarten registration. During the last 8 years, we have experienced a 30% increase amounting to 1,184 students in our K-8 student body. This has required us to add 46 classrooms, a 23% increase. Brookline now has the fastest growing student body throughout Massachusetts on a percentage basis. Data suggests that this growth will continue for at least the next 5 years. Therefore, I will speak about the reasons behind Article 3's requests, and for context, also outline some contemplated future plans. Article 3 asks you to approve an allocation to the school system's operating budget of an additional $430,000 out of a total of $800,000 in funds recently made available to the town. This year's kindergarten class of 666 students is the largest ever for Brookline to the best of our knowledge. The requested allocation will help us fund the unanticipated record-breaking kindergarten growth, requiring, as you've heard, 5 classrooms beyond our budget. These additional classes require 11.3 full-time equivalents of additional staff, increasing our costs by about $700,000. Article 3 also asks you to approve a $1,750,000 capital expenditure to fund a feasibility study which will result in a schematic design for the expansion of our devotion school. This is an understandable requirement of the Massachusetts School Building Authority, which has indicated its willingness to provide funding for this, our third and largest project. Devotion is one of the several future expansion projects we foresee as necessary to accommodate our continuing growth. The MSBA has already funded about 40% of the cost of the renovations recently completed at our Heath and Runkle schools. This is extraordinary support by a very professional state agency, and it will not be our last request. We are grateful that your advisory committee and the Board of Selectmen support these requests. It seems appropriate to provide you with some context since our request regarding Article 3 is related to our longer-term planning. What we see ahead of us, in addition to the Devotion project, is as follows. We must remove most, if not all, of our pre-K classrooms from our current K-8 buildings to make room for additional K-8 classrooms. We will use leased space for these pre-K classrooms. On a temporary basis, we will likely use several modular classrooms located at Baker and Lawrence at least. At Driscoll, we might replace the 20-year-old bricked-over modular units with permanent space, providing the result will produce more classrooms. We are in the throes of developing a concept for a new school located at the old Lincoln campus. For those wondering, the Devotion School population will not fit into the Lincoln School during construction. We must issue a request for proposals to develop concepts around the expansion and creative reuse of available Brookline High School space. The 8 years of kindergarten growth are steadily advancing through our K-8 system and will begin to impact our high school by 2015. By 2018, we expect to be educating 2,200 high school students compared to the current high school population of 1,770 students. And by 2022, this enrollment will be closer to 2,500, more than 700 students over the current enrollment. Your school committee recognizes that our entire community should be involved in this planning. We expect that a town school group will consider options which would then be examined by several focus groups and a public meeting. After receiving input, the group would then whittle down the options for a presentation to another public meeting. During the past 7 summers, the town's building staff has reconfigured the space in our buildings to produce a miraculous number of additional classrooms. Our school administration has managed to keep abreast of the many innovations taking place in K-8 education while simultaneously anticipating and adapting, even at the last minute, to our student growth. And as construction occurred at Heath and Runkle, both staff and parents were seriously inconvenienced, ultimately resulting in new, bright, and functional spaces within both schools. Many thanks to all. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Mr. Lowe, you had a question.
Superintendent Lupini would be glad to come down if you'd like him to help.
Well, let's see if it's necessary.
Got it.
Mr. Lowe.
Yes, Mr. Moderator, thank you. I'm wondering if this
Well, who are you?
Oh, I'm sorry, David Lowe, Precinct 11, and a Driscoll parent. But I'm also wondering if this is the appropriate opportunity to think about in designing Devotion's renovation, to think about energy efficiency and the use of resources to save ongoing operating expenses throughout the school's future.
Mr. Morse.
There already has been a hearing regarding several concepts for the devotion school, and that issue was one which has been raised and will be considered by the building committee that Selectman DeWitt outlined.
Thank you. On the motion at the bottom of page 1 of the yellow supplement, making the budget adjustments in paragraph 1 and you can stand down, Mr. Morse, and appropriating $1,750,000 for the devotion school plans. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, raise your hands. Any abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. Sorry, there was one no vote. Motion carries by a vote of 202 to 1. We proceed now to Article 4. Before we get there, and before I continue to forget to remind you, whenever you leave town meeting this evening, please deposit your handheld voting devices in one of the blue bins in the back of the room. It doesn't matter which one you deposit it in. It doesn't have to be in the aisle in which you checked in, but please avoid burdening our town clerk's office by having to track down people who have taken these devices home and put them in one of the blue bins. Thank you. Article 4. The motion under Article 4 is on page 4-8. Move that the town amend the general bylaws by inserting a sentence in bold in section 2.52 relating to public hearings of the Advisory Committee and Board of Selectmen, moved by Mr. Lynn Jones, seconded by Mr. Bors. Mr. Lynn Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Sean Lynn Jones, Precinct 1, Chair of the Moderators Committee on Public Hearings, speaking for that committee. The full report of the committee is in the combined reports, not under Article 4, but under Article 17, if you'd like to look at it. It discusses some recommendations that are actually not in the form of a warrant article, as well as the work of the committee in general. So I'll just say a little bit about the committee. As you recall, at the May 2012 town meeting, Article 9, similar to Article 5 before this town meeting, was referred to a moderators committee. The moderator appointed Harry Friedman, Helen Herman, town meeting members, former town administrator Richard Leary, and former chair of the selectmen Donna Calico, and myself to serve on that committee, and I was elected chair, and Ms. Calico became secretary. Over the summer, we solicited input from town committees by email, held a public hearing, held a meeting with the chairs of the Selectmen Advisory Committee, Preservation Commission, Conservation Committee, Commission, and Town Council, and several other meetings at which we deliberated what to do. Although we had quite a diverse committee with many different opinions, different kinds of backgrounds, we eventually unanimously recommended the warrant article 4 and continue to recommend it unanimously, although it was amended slightly to clarify it by both the Advisory Committee and the Board of Selectmen. We agreed on the importance of public hearings, on the need for public input into the process, and on the important signal that having public hearings sends, inviting more public participation in Brookline politics. We sought a recommendation that was simple and would command broad support. Our major recommendation is Article 4, which would require that both the Advisory Committee or a subcommittee of the Advisory Committee and the Board of Selectmen hold a public hearing prior to voting on a warrant article, and we put that in the section of the bylaw that pertains to the preparation of the combined reports for town meeting, because we think this is a very important part of the process of making those recommendations. We limited that recommendation to the Advisory Committee and the Board of Selectmen because we think they really are in a category by themselves. They make the overwhelming majority of the written recommendations and other recommendations to town meeting. They're required to do so in the town bylaw. And it's most important that there be an opportunity for public input in the process that those committees use to prepare their recommendations, hence a bylaw to require it. And it's also been a long-standing tradition that although there hasn't been a requirement, that both those committees, the Advisory Committee and the Board of Selectmen, have indeed held public hearings as they prepared their recommendations for town meeting. There are other committees that generally prepare recommendations, such as the Planning Board and the Preservation Commission. They're often required to do so, for example, the Planning Board for a zoning amendment by state law. We did not extend this bylaw requirement to other committees. We suggested that the Board of Selectmen adopt a policy that would require such committees to hold a public hearing before making recommendations or taking a vote on warrant articles. As I pointed out before, there's a big difference between the Selectmen and the Advisory Committee and all the other committees. We really don't need a one-size-fits-all approach to every single committee. The bylaw requirement is most important and should apply to the Selectmen and to the Advisory Committee. And I'd note also in passing that we don't always have a bylaw. We often do things by policy in this town. There's no bylaw regarding the town-school partnership, which is an incredible part of our whole budget process and planning process. No bylaw to govern many of our fiscal and financial policies, which have kept the town on a sound budgetary footing.
1 minute.
The Board of Selectmen appoints committees and should monitor and enforce and update a policy as necessary. And there may be some cases in which a committee, which reports directly to the Selectmen and not to town meeting, shouldn't have a public hearing, but should enable the Selectmen to hold a public hearing on its recommendations. We also noted that if this approach, or having a policy, doesn't work out, if it's problematic, we could revisit it and enact a bylaw in the future. The Selectmen has adopted a policy that is slightly different from the one that we suggested. In some ways, it's narrower, such as Stanley Spiegel's amendment to Article 5, and in other ways it's broader in suggesting or recommending strongly that there be public comment whenever a committee discusses a warrant article. I urge you to vote favorable action on Article 4. It's received unanimous support from the Advisory Committee, the Selectmen, and from the Moderators Committee. It's a simple but important step that has widespread support, and we think it would go a long way toward addressing the need for public input into the process of formulating recommendations for town meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Witt.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Betsy DeWitt again, speaking for the Board of Selectmen, and the board is in substantial agreement with the Advisory Committee. We thank the Moderators Committee for their good work and for their report under tight time constraints. The Board of Selectmen believes in open and transparent government. We agree with the original petitioners on the goals of increasing citizen engagement and encouraging public participation in our legislative process. The proposal under Article 4 is straightforward, simple, and effective. The amendment requires the Board of Selectmen and Advisory Committee or a subcommittee of the Advisory Committee to hold at least one duly noticed public hearing prior to a final vote on any article on the warrant. And first, I want to acknowledge my own confusion and perhaps that of others about the definition of a public hearing. My initial understanding was that a public hearing is a formal or statutory or regulatory quasi-judicial proceeding, such as defined in the Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 30A on Government Administrative Procedures, which I quote, "Adjudicatory proceeding means a proceeding before an agency in which legal rights, duties, or privileges of specifically named persons are required by constitutional right or by any provision of the general laws to be determined after opportunity for an agency hearing." The Board of Selectmen holds adjudicatory public hearings on matters ranging from licensing restaurants to citizen complaints against public employees. I've since learned that there can be public hearings not requiring formal procedures or determinations, and these are best known as non-adjudicatory public hearings, which is the language in the proposed amendment. Town Council has advised us that these may be held following the open meeting law notification and guidelines for public meetings, and that the requirements of this bylaw will be incorporated into the annual open meeting trainings for elected and appointed members of public bodies. Article 4 differs from Article 9 at the Maytown meeting and Article 5 tonight in that it does not require the up to 60 different boards, commissions, and committees to be subject to this bylaw. Thanks to the Moderators Committee, there is a list in their report after page 17-1 in the combined reports. Some of these boards, commissions, and committees are permanent, some temporary, some appointed by the selectmen, some appointed by the moderator, and some are elected. The Zoning Board of Appeals, the Planning Board, the Preservation Commission, and Conservation Commission are required under their enabling statutes to hold public hearings on any warrant article falling under their regulatory oversight. At town meeting tonight, Articles 6, 10, and 11 are in that category. The board makes every effort to hear all views and facts before taking a position on an article. The selectmen do not believe that every committee discussing an article has to have a separate public hearing, especially if they're reporting back to the board, who will incorporate their advice into the selectmen's recommendation to town meeting. And two good examples are the Board of Assessors and the Advisory Council on Public Health, who regularly provide technical expertise and advice to the selectmen on specific topics. We were also concerned that scheduling multiple separate public hearings would be cumbersome and burdensome on petitioners, who would then have to attend many meetings with a limited time frame. Article 4 strikes a reasonable balance for all interested parties. As recommended by the Moderators Committee, the board has adopted a standing policy with respect to public hearings on warrant articles, and it's consistent with the bylaw amendment to the combined reports. Quote,
you have 1 minute.
Prior to submitting an independent report for publication in the combined reports to town meeting on any article included in the warrant, the Board of Selectmen and any boards, commissions, or committees as defined in section 1.14 of the town's bylaws that are appointed by the Board of Selectmen shall hold at least one non-adjudicatory public hearing on the subject matter. And there's language about notice, which I'm not going to read to you because it's in the warrant book.
Thank you. You've got 30 seconds.
The failure to comply with this policy does not affect the legality of any town action. This policy will be sent to every town board, commission, and committee, regardless of whether elected or appointed, with a cover memo indicating that the Board of Selectmen expects that all will make a good faith effort to include comments from the public on any warrant article that comes before them. We thank the petitioners who raised an important issue that will result in better warrant article review process. However, the board strongly prefers the less complicated approach recommended by the Moderators Committee, and therefore the unanimous Board of Selectmen recommends favorable action on the amended vote offered by the Advisory Committee under Article 4.
Thank you, Mr. Bors.
Good evening. Harry Bors speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee. Public hearings are a very important part of our town meeting process and, for that matter, our community form of government. For Brookline has a long tradition of vigorous public discourse, and the Advisory Committee believes that public hearings can result in better warrant articles and encourage more participation in town government. Articles 4 and 5 both address a common issue: public participation in the deliberative process of considering warrant articles. Article 4 a bit more narrowly, and Article 5 more broadly. And I should point out, 4 and 5 are not mutually exclusive. Article 4 comes to us from the Moderators Committee, and it's a direct consequence of the town meeting consideration and referral of Article 9 this past spring. The article would have, that is the Article 9 this spring, would have had all boards, committees, and commissions hold at least one public hearing prior to taking a vote with respect to an article on the warrant. That's in the words of the article. The Moderators Committee unanimously endorsed the notion that public hearings were important enough to safeguard via our bylaws. Its proposal is that the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee, or a subcommittee of the Advisory Committee, each hold a public hearing on a warrant article before taking a position. The Moderators Committee goes on to advise that the Board of Selectmen establish a standing policy with regard to hearings held by the boards and commissions that it appoints, recognizing that it is the Board of Selectmen that we have elected to oversee these boards and commissions. And as you've heard, the Board of Selectmen do have that standing policy. Now, many on the Advisory Committee noted that the bulk of recommendations that come before town meeting come from the two bodies, the Selectmen and the Advisory Committee. And especially through the Advisory Committee hearing process, the public, as well as town employees and appointees, can engage in this process. And they see this article, Article 4, as a reasoned and reasonable approach that ensures a public voice in the consideration of warrant articles. Now, others of our members felt that this article did not go quite far enough and should also include other boards and committees as well, rather than simply relying on the good graces of those committees. And they also point out that policies can be changed, whereas a bylaw would have to come back to town meeting. But they too do feel that this article is at least a good start, and we're supportive of it. And therefore, by a unanimous vote, the Advisory Committee is recommending favorable action on Article 4.
Thank you, Mr. Bors. On the motion on page 4-8, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, raise your hands. Any abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. Sorry. The motion carries by a vote of 202 to 2. We turn now to Article 5. The motion of the petitioner is included in the Advisory Committee report on page 5-9, moved by Ms. Frawley, seconded by Mr. Davis, that the town amend the town bylaws by adding Article 3.22 relating to the public's right to be heard on warrant articles. We have two amendments. One by Mr. Rosenthal on the, well, whatever this is, orange supplement, page 1. Mr. Rosenthal would replace the second and third paragraphs of the motion on page 5-9 with the two paragraphs, the second and third paragraph of the underlined material on page 1 of the orange supplement. It's moved by Mr. Rosenthal. Is there a second? Second. Motion is seconded. Mr. Spiegel offers an amendment found on page 1 of the pink supplement. Mr. Spiegel would add in the first line of the motion on page 5-9, after the words "any committee" is defined in section 1.1.4, he would add the words on the underlined wording on page 1 of the pink supplement, so that it would read, "Any committee is defined in section 1.1.4 that transmits its position on an article on the warrant to town meeting," and I'm told that the word "members" should be stricken, either in a written report, electronically, or by oral presentation at or prior to town meeting. Motion by Mr. Spiegel. Is it seconded? Motion is seconded. And there's one Scrivener's error that I want to correct. In all versions of the motion before you, the reference to the open meeting law, which appears in the second paragraph of the motion on page 5-9, the parenthetical description should read G period L period and then insert small c period for chapter 38. Ms. Frawley.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Regina Frawley from Precinct 16 and co-author of the original Article 9 that the Board of Selectmen has graciously acknowledged is why they have finally agreed to hold public hearings. In the section of the law that requires them already to report to in the combined reports. We don't feel it goes far enough, though, because we've been involved for a really long time and seen that committees will make a recommendation, as was just reported, based on, and they will reference those committees. And if those committees didn't hear from you, didn't allow the public to speak, it's going to be absent that wisdom that you bring to the table. Yoga Berra spoke of deja vu all over again, and we're here again. But there's something else that's been deja vu tonight and recently. I was here 6 years ago on the mandatory training bylaw, and you graciously passed it. However, the same thing that happened then and the same arguments that happened then are happening on this article. Article 5, let's say what it does do. It requires nearly every town committee that bothers or is choosing to report to one of their appointing authorities or to town meeting, position on an article that's before the warrant, to hold at least one public hearing, period. That's simple. In the 12 years I've been back in town meetings and the many years before that I was in town meeting, very few ever report directly to town meeting, and you're going to be voting on Mr. Spiegel's limiting amendment that will only require it for those that report directly. What is a public hearing? I discovered many of you didn't know. A public hearing is a portion, usually, of a public meeting. A public meeting is already required to have the public sit there and listen to them. A public hearing means they get to listen to you. And in our case, it's before, very limited, it's only before a committee will vote and make a recommendation and/or to its appointing authority to us on a warrant article. Having said that, that was always true in the 40 or more years I've been at town meeting and the 40 or more years I've attended meetings at town hall, until October 2010, when Chair DeWitt decided that it was, and she's right, it was her prerogative not to hold public hearings on warrant articles. I was quite surprised to discover legally she had no obligation to do that. What I was very unhappy to discover is the reasoning behind it. And another selectman said, by the time that, and I quote, by the time the selectmen vote on a warrant article before town meeting, we already know all we need to know. We don't need to hear from the public. That's a reversal of decades of tradition and good democratic process. Having said that, you and I are the public, not just our constituents. We really are just as subject to not being able to speak or weigh in on a warrant article, same as anybody else. We are called as town meeting members, elected voters. We're not public officials as town meeting members. Now, what are the reasons they used 6 years ago when I was here against the mandatory training that they now brag about? 1, it will be burdensome on volunteer officials and their staff. 2, we'll have trouble recruiting capable volunteers. 3, committees will be confused and intimidated before the public. And 4, volunteers are too busy to take the training and will lose expert volunteers.
You have 1 minute.
None of that has happened. So tonight, you're going to hear the 2 amendments that will modify whether or not a committee does hear it. And the reasons they now give in their amendments, and the selectmen agree, it will be burdensome on volunteers, officials, and their staff, and they added petitioners. The town will have trouble recruiting capable volunteers. Committees consisting of experts in their professional fields will be confused and intimidated debating before the public. And finally, expert volunteers are too busy to take the training.
30 seconds.
So I've heard that before. I've also been called somebody who is too democratic. I hope that's true, and I hope it's true for you too. Democracy's a mess, but it's the best thing going, as many have acknowledged, considering the alternative. I hope you vote for the 5-9 version of Article 5. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. DeWitt. I'm sorry, Ms. Daly.
Thank you. Nancy Daly for the Board of Selectmen. The Board of Selectmen does not believe that Article 5 is necessary since Article 4 is passed and the Board of Selectmen has adopted the policy that the boards and commissions and committees that are appointed by us would, and any that report directly to town meeting in the warrant should hold public hearings. As Chairman DeWitt has said, we will actually pass that policy out even to those committees that aren't appointed by us. But we do favor the Spiegel amendment if people want to vote for Article 5. On school projects, people who are interested have to attend the public hearings at the School Building Committee, the Board of Selectmen, the Planning Board, the Zoning Board of Appeals, the last two bodies which have to hold public hearings by law, the Advisory Committee, Subcommittee, and possibly the School Committee. While there may be a few people who don't mind attending 3 or 4 meetings a week and waiting hours to speak, for most people this is a burden, particularly those who need to hire babysitters and senior citizens who may not like to drive at night. I know on the Runkle School project that I was hearing from parents that the schedule was killing them trying to get to all these meetings. Proponents and opponents of a warrant article often feel that they cannot miss any of these hearings, and yet it can become overwhelming to try to get to all of them. We don't think that the benefits of adding to those meetings outweighs the burdens. While we think it is appropriate, as we said in our policy, for those reporting directly to town meeting to hear from the public in a hearing, there are a number of committees that might consider a warrant article so as to give advice to the Board of Selectmen or the Advisory Committee. And the Advisory Council on Public Health is a good example. They have a number of widely recognized medical experts on their roster, and they give us advice based on their scientific expertise on public health matters. They usually do this at one of our public meetings, most likely the same night that we're hearing commentary from others on a warrant article. But public hearings can often be extremely contentious and difficult to manage. I understand that the police were called at one recently. The question is whether we should require a group like the Advisory Council on Public Health to hear possibly extended public commentary that may include deeply felt beliefs, but ones that do not necessarily have any scientific backing. I would suggest that the appropriate place for that kind of commentary is before the Board of Selectmen or the Advisory Committee subcommittee, where it will be weighed along with the Council on Public Health's report. However, if a public health issue is the central point of a warrant article and the Advisory Committee on Public Health is going to report directly to town meeting, then it makes sense for them to have a public hearing on the matter, as they are now required to do under our policy. At a certain point, however, the proliferation of hearings actually begins to work against democracy, as many people feel that they simply can't keep up with the schedule and still meet their own work, family, or health concerns. The board urges you, therefore, to vote for the Spiegel Amendment, and then you may vote for Article 5 based on whether you think it's necessary. We don't. It does catch some committees that are not appointed by the Board of Selectmen, and it also includes people giving written reports to town meeting members as well as oral reports as well as the written. The board voted unanimously for the Spiegel Amendment. We did not take a position on the Rosenthal Amendment, and all the members of the board then abstained on the vote for Article 5 as amended because, as I said before, we didn't think it was necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bors.
Good evening, Harry Bors speaking on Article 5. Article 5, as I had mentioned before, applies more broadly than does Article 4. It requires that all boards, committees, and commissions hold a public hearing before taking a position, quote, relative to an article on the warrant. And it is true that the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee account for the bulk of the reports and recommendations that come to town meeting regarding warrant articles, but from time to time, other bodies do report as well. Conservation Commission, Planning Board, HAB, there are several. Traditionally, all of these have held public hearings, and we think that's terrific. but one should not have to rely on tradition because players change over time. And a bylaw ensures that tradition will be maintained. Now, not all members of the advisory committee support this article. For them, Article 4 is more than sufficient. They feel the application of this article is far too broad and captures some committees that are meant to be informative rather than deliberative, and that those views can be shared in the larger public hearing process held by the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee. They worry that there is such a thing as overkill, and that this could lead to an exhaustive series of relatively unproductive public hearings. Most of our members, however, believe that if a committee feels strongly enough to consider and vote on a warrant article, then it's important enough to hold a public hearing. They don't perceive this requirement as being overly burdensome at all, and they go on to point out that warrant articles, by their very nature, are public exercises. Now, the committee did recommend a couple of changes to the original language, allowing school subcommittees to hold public hearings in lieu of the full committee, removing the phrase non-adjudicatory, feeling that it didn't add anything but could be confusing, and putting a clause at the end of the article that would hold town meeting harmless, or at least not render its vote null and void should a committee not adhere to this article. We did consider at the same time the Rosenthal amendment because we did have it, and we voted strongly against that. The amendment's intent to reduce the burden of multiple and perhaps redundant hearings is laudable, but we felt that the bylaw should not be satisfied simply by the quorum of one committee sitting through the hearing of another committee, because often different committees bring different perspectives, and that's not something that we would want to discourage. And a hearing really should be an active endeavor rather than a passive one. So our vote on Article 5, while not unanimous, was a vote of 14 in favor, 10 opposed, with 1 abstention, recommending favorable action on Article 5. And we subsequently considered the recommendation, the so-called Spiegel Amendment on Article 5, and I don't know if you want me to comment to that now, Mr. Moderator, or come back to it.
Go ahead.
Okay. So as I said, subsequent to our vote on Article 5, we considered the so-called Spiegel Amendment. The petitioner's motion essentially sets a floor as to where the bylaw offered under Article 5 would be applied. So with this amendment, all boards, committees, and commissions taking a vote, transmitting a position, or making a recommendation on a warrant article to town meeting would be required to hold at least one public hearing. Those committees or subcommittees providing a position on an article, say to a larger board or a committee, with no intention of offering any specific recommendation to town meeting, perhaps their comment was solicited by their appointing agency, would not be required to hold the public hearing, though its appointing agency still could require it. Now, the petitioner notes that at least 2 public hearings will be convened by the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee on each warrant article, and even more if the other boards or commissions vote on a recommendation to go to town meeting. Again, that could be the Conservation Commission, what have you. The concern is that if the bylaw is extended down to every little committee, it may simply induce hearing fatigue, requiring petitioners, proponents, and opponents to attend multiple, possibly redundant hearings. The petitioner believes that the requirement of this article should be for those committees conveying a position to town meeting, and that for smaller committees and subcommittees, some of these are for special purposes, and their comments are meant to offer a more technical appraisal. And these views will be but a single component in the larger consideration by their appointing authority, which may, after holding public hearings, make a recommendation to town meeting. Now, a number of our members were concerned that applying Article 5 to these types of groups may dissuade productive engagement, stifle candor, or burden some of the smaller committees. And so they view this amendment as providing a good balance to the proposed bylaw under 5. Other of our members felt the bylaw is not at all onerous, and regardless of a committee's size or a subcommittee's size, and they felt that this amendment was not needed. They maintain the requirement can be easily met by having a period for public hearing at the same time as a scheduled meeting. And they also acknowledge that, yes, some subcommittees are assembled to provide specific technical capabilities.
However,
There's often much technical expertise outside of committees, and that information can be gleaned in a public hearing and often lead to better final outcome. Countering this, of course, was the observation that much of that input can and should be provided at the larger public hearing held by a committee that will be reporting to town meeting, and that rolling a public hearing into a meeting may satisfy the bylaw, but it may be a public hearing in name only, lacking meaningful attendance and input. No one wants to encourage a hollow gesture. The bottom line here is that this amendment addresses the fundamental issue of how deeply we want this requirement to be applied within our deliberative process. For many, it should apply at every level, and for others, it should apply just to those offering an opinion for town meeting's consideration. And on this issue, the advisory committee is nearly evenly split. So the advisory committee, by a vote of 12 in favor and 11 opposed, is recommending favorable action on the so-called Spiegel Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal.
Marty Rosenthal, Precinct 9. I have my black sheep tie. I don't have a lone wolf tie, but I'm here in support of my own amendment, and I'm not going to repeat what I wrote in the explanation that you have before you. I'm hoping you've all read it, or else you'll read it while I'm talking, or even better, while Stanley is talking. No, only kidding. But on the merits, the only thing I want to add is that the bylaw that I wrote in 2007 does go beyond the open meeting law in terms of the requirements of it's not called minutes, but a summary of the discussion. And so every committee would have to have a summary of the discussion, and I think would have to talk about what each speaker says at a public hearing. What I want to do instead of going over what I wrote in the explanation is do a little bit to establish my credentials on this issue. I've been supporting public hearings and public participation for decades. Back in 1987, I have my dog-eared copy of the report by me and Jeffrey Allen on the Selectmen's Subcommittee on Police and Community Relations. We said in there that on police issues, they should generally be decided only after a public hearing. Broad community input should be solicited, particularly from groups, agencies, or individuals known to have an interest or knowledge in such issues. I've been pushing for roll call votes, and thank goodness for the electronic machine tonight. Since 1999 was my first tab letter on that issue. In 2007, the bylaw that I mentioned that I wrote on electronic notices said this is intended to better implement the spirit of the open meeting law to improve opportunities for broader and more meaningful citizen participation in the business of town government. Last May, when this came before you in Article 9, PAX wrote by me and Frank Farlow, PAC strongly supports the concept and much of what the petitioners propose. However, we think it leaves too many questions unanswered. Many of those questions have been answered. But this fall, I still felt the issue of excessive hearings was still there. I called it to the attention in August of the Moderators Committee, but they obviously went in a different route. I voted a different direction. I voted for Article 4, but I just don't think it goes far enough, and I'm going to vote for Article 5 whether either of these amendments get passed. However, this fall, I started working primarily with Bob Stein of CTOS on the excessive hearing issue, and even though it seemed like it came up late in the process, I've been working on it for about 2 or 3 months and now have the proposal before you. I also yield to nobody in the expertise on bringing citizens' petitions. I don't know if anybody has brought more than I have, and I'm going to indulge in a little of my time with a sprint down memory lane. My first one, I think, was 1982.
Well, Mr. Rosenthal, could you please confine yourself to the subject matter before us?
Yeah, the point is that, that my amendment is viewed to helping not just the committees, but also the petitioners who bring warrant articles. I think that they don't need 3 or 4 or 5 public hearings. It's hard enough to get people to come to one public hearing. And so, having been through that process on at least 15 occasions, which I'm not going to list at the moderator's direction, I know what it's like to bring people to public hearings. And sometimes if you don't get people to a public hearing, the people that are holding the hearing think there's not enough support.
You have one minute.
Thank you. Most citizens don't want to come in more than 2 or 3 times. Even once is enough for plenty of them. So I have no personal stake in this. If I do another petition article, I'll survive what I call excessive public hearings. I hope there'll be at least 2. The Article 4 doesn't cover the school committee. I don't think it goes far enough. I do believe that Article 5, without either Stanley's or my amendments, goes too far, and I think it personifies Ralph Waldo Emerson.
30 seconds.
I'm going to paraphrase that consistency is the hobgoblin of good intentions and good government. I think my amendment is better than Stanley's. I've added a mandate to invite the principal petitioners. I think Stanley goes a little too far to moderate Article 5, and I think mine is a good compromise. I hope you'll consider it, in spite of the fact that none of the officials to my left and right are supporting me.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And Mr. Safer, we're going to hear from Mr. Davis and Mr. Spiegel, and then I'll call on you, so if you want to have a seat. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Jonathan Davis, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 10, and co-petitioner of Article 5. The Spiegel Amendment eliminates the guaranteed right of the public to speak before all committees that take positions on warrant articles unless the committees report their positions to town meeting. As a practical matter, very few committees except the Selectmen and the Advisory Committee report their position on warrant articles to town meeting, so the effect of the Spiegel Amendment is most of the time to deny the public the right to a guaranteed public hearing except before the Selectmen and the Advisory Committee. The Spiegel Amendment was discussed and debated at the Advisory Committee meeting the night of November 8th. One of the major arguments in favor of the Spiegel Amendment is that if more than 2 committees are planning to take a voted position on a warrant article, it will be too stressful for Brookline residents who want to speak about the warrant article to decide which committees to attend and speak at. The amendment's solution to this stress is to take away the guaranteed right to speak unless the committees are the Advisory Committee or the Selectmen. So the argument in favor of the Spiegel Amendment is that Brookline residents aren't capable of deciding for themselves which of the committee hearings to attend and speak at. Now, the November 8th discussion and the Spiegel Amendment also completely overlooks the flip side. What can the people bring to committees to help the committees make better decisions about warrant articles? Denying the public a right to speak at committees, except as a practical matter, only the Advisory Committee and the Selectmen, deprives committees of the ability to improve their own decision-making. For example, consider a so-called expert committee that is considering a warrant article. Brookline is blessed with many experts who do not sit on expert committees. If there were a guaranteed public hearing, these other experts living in town but not appointed to an expert committee could speak at the public hearing in the language of the expert committee, and this could well help the expert committee make a better decision. There's another argument that was pushed in favor of the Spiegel Amendment, that eliminating a guaranteed right of the public to speak at committees considering warrant articles will make it easier for petitioners of warrant articles who won't have to attend more public hearings. This argument actually gets things backwards. It's not public hearings that make warrant article petitioners attend committee meetings. It's that the committees are already conducting meetings about the warrant article. Whether or not there is a calendared public hearing that is part of the committee meeting, the petitioners will be attending the committee meeting anyway to hear what the committee is thinking, and also because the petitioners are not part of the general public. They're petitioners of the article that is being considered by the committee. And as a matter of due diligence, the committee will invariably ask the petitioners to explain their warrant articles, and the committee will invariably dialogue with the petitioners. Finally, we believe that public hearings and public input are important democratic principles, and these important democratic principles should be made general principles of general applicability.
1 minute.
That means that if there are to be exceptions to the democratic principle, cutbacks of the right to guaranteed public hearings, these exceptions should be brought on a case-by-case basis to future town meetings. The Spiegel Amendment has it backwards. Under the Spiegel Amendment, the democratic principle is limited, and any expansions of the democratic principle must be brought case by case before future town meetings. This will be very difficult and places the anti-democratic impulse above what should be a general democratic principle. We ask you to support democracy, support the right of the governed to speak to their governors, and to support the assistance that the public can bring to the committees. We urge you to vote yes on the amendment that appears on page 5-9 of the combined reports, and to vote no action on the Spiegel Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spiegel.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Stanley Spiegel from Precinct 2. Who knew I was so anti-democratic? I never realized that. And I don't believe it's true. I don't think I have things backwards. I think I'm trying to strive for a reasonable balance, because what's really important is to have the groups or individuals who are trying hard to influence votes right here in this room. We are the bottom line, and it's those groups who want to influence our votes who should have the benefit of public input. I believe this article goes too far, although I suppose you could argue that any individual who steps up here should have his own public hearing, because he might be enlightened and come out with a different endpoint. But obviously that would be absurd. And I also think it's not realistic to have every small committee which may want to consider an article and come up with a position on it to be forced to undergo the public hearing process. Now, we've heard that public hearings are just trivial. You just stick it on the agenda just like a public meeting. That's a public hearing in name only, and it gets you nowhere. It doesn't get you information. It only attracts the usual suspects, the folks, a very tiny subset of the public, which scans the town website studiously, attends many meetings, and is happy to have their voices heard wherever they can have them heard. But to really get input from the public, what you need to have is outreach, and it's not required in any law, in any statute, as far as I know, certainly not in this one. But on the advisory committee, when we have a public hearing, we reach out to stakeholders. Maybe it's labor leaders, maybe it's parents, maybe it's a neighborhood association, maybe it's the handicap commission on the disabled, or maybe it's the Council on Aging. Whoever we feel is concerned in an important way with what's at hand. That's a public hearing. To just call something a public hearing, slap it on the agenda, that is not at all a reasonable thing to do. Because you're not going to get the information. You're not going to get input from the public, which is what the idea of a public hearing, if it means anything, it means hearing from the public in general, not just the, as I said before, the usual suspects. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, we voted funding for the Carlton Street footbridge, and in addition to that funding, I actually put forward a resolution urging us to have handicap access ramps. Now, it happened 2 days after that. I realized that I could do that. I saw that the Commission on the Disabled was meeting. So I went down there. I presented to them. They heard about the ramps. It's not a big surprise that they decided to vote their support. They weren't reporting to the selectmen. They weren't reporting to town meeting directly. They were just said, yeah, we like that. And I was able to say that in my speech at town meeting, that they favored having handicap access ramps as part of the footbridge. I don't care how you here felt about that, but I think it was important that they not have been inhibited from saying we can't take a position because we don't have time to schedule a public meeting now, a public hearing. We don't have time to do that, and the bylaw says we can't do it, and therefore I'm sorry we can't take a position. I think that would be a loss. A similar thing happened with the traffic light at Green Street, the pedestrian walk signal, where I happened to appear at the Council on Aging, and they also rendered their opinion. Again, not a formal public hearing by any means, but it was good, I think, that they not have been muzzled or silenced by the inability to fulfill the requirements of the bylaw as it stands. What I've done in this amendment, which I hope you'll consider and act favorably on,
you have 1 minute.
Isn't such a big loss to town meeting members. You can already hear on various articles from the library trustees, the school committee, various moderators committees, the transportation board, the preservation commission, the conservation commission, the planning board, depending on the article, all of these groups weigh in, and when they do weigh in the combined reports or through other means of communication, this would still have the requirement of requiring a public hearing, and I think that's reasonable. So this does not at all gut the essence of what Article 5 is proposing. In fact, I think it makes it more realistic. It doesn't muzzle anybody. It doesn't tell anybody to be quiet. And by the way, one last thing I'll say. In essence, this is really a resolution anyway, passing as a bylaw. There's no consequences to this. There's no penalty for failure to comply. And therefore, I would advise any group, even if this passes without the amendment, to disregard it if bringing forward their view would be helpful to town meeting members, whether they've had the public hearing or not. But I think there's no point in putting it in the bylaw, and I urge you to vote favorable action on my amendment, and I thank you so much.
Mr. Safer.
Josh Safer, Precinct 16, and also Chairman of the Transportation Board. I'm not speaking for the Transportation Board, but being that chair does influence what I'm about to say. I'm failing to see what the so-called burden would be to the committees by Article 5. At the Transportation Board, I observed that interested members of the public routinely appear in order to comment or to witness our deliberations, not feeling any shame or concern or what shall I say, burden to them. We, as a matter of routine, allow members of the public to speak, all members of the public to speak on any issue. I guess every single article on our agenda is, for all practical purposes, a mini hearing, if you want to consider it so. And I guess I occasionally have to limit people who are verbose, but that's about as far as it goes. And so I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking, isn't the point of Article 5 here really just to codify what we're essentially doing on the Transportation Board and make sure that members of the public, when they bother to show, can speak? And I want to ask kind of a rhetorical, or I don't know if it's a rhetorical question or not, actually. Here's my question. Could we simply define the first discussion on a warrant article by any of these committees, boards, commissions, etc., for all practical purposes to be a hearing per se, and by doing so, unless of course they want to designate some other hearings specifically, and by doing so that would obligate that committee, board, commission to accept input from the public and not muzzle the public who want to be there and are usually there anyway. And or maybe perhaps that's what we're already doing with this article as said without either of the amendments.
Thank you, Ms. Jonas.
Hi, Elisa Jonas, Precinct 16. I just want to further that a little bit. Selectman Daley mentioned that petitioners and opponents feel they can't miss any committee meeting, so they can be sure to be heard. So they are showing up already, and if there's other members of the public who feel it's important enough to show up, they're there so that they can be heard. And the only thing that, if we don't codify having public hearings, they just will not be able to speak, and I think that's what's frustrating, to come out and then not be able to speak because it's at the discretion of the committee. And if a committee, if it's relevant, if the issue is relevant enough to the committee that they feel that it is appropriate for them to vote on it, then the advisory committee and the Board of Selectmen are going to think that it is important for them to listen to what that committee of experts on that particular issue are saying. So even if they don't report directly to town meeting, they will be influencing town meeting indirectly by influencing selectmen and the advisory committee. And those committees, while they are experts in their fields, they're not experts in particular areas of their fields and can always gain. And constituents who are particularly concerned about the issue, if it's affecting them more than others, will often be the ones inspired to do the research to be able to share information to that committee that they don't have so that they can vote in a more educated manner. Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Jones, Precinct 3, Gary Jones. And I want to just mention something that, to me, is very simple about Article 5. I mean, I want to read the first sentence. Any committee as defined in a certain section, before taking its first or only vote with respect to an article on the warrant, must hold a duly noticed public hearing. Now, that doesn't mean discussion. I mean, if a committee wants to discuss an article, fine. You know, that doesn't require them to hold a public hearing. And that's why I don't see why this article is so onerous, because those committees that want to take a position, even an appointed committee or an elected committee or a moderator's committee that's appointed, it seems to me like on the library board, we do this from time to time. And some of our most fruitful public hearings on the renovation of the library came from listening to people. Because everybody seems to talk about the onerous quality of a public hearing to the poor public. But what I don't hear people mentioning, when you sit on the other side of a board and you listen to public hearings, you get information. And if any board, whether it's elected or appointed, is going to make a decision and take a vote, it seems to me then you should, I don't want to get profane, but you should really be serious about listening to the public. Because how can any board that doesn't hear the public, and if you're sitting on a board, you're not on the Board of Selectmen, you're not on the advisory board, you're simply there, and if you don't have, and you have a requirement to have a public hearing, you're going to get a vote, and you're not going to be listening to other voices except your own board members. And, you know, to me, and if you look at Spiegel's amendment, you're only, you know, or one of the amendments, I forget which, you know, you can have a quorum go to listen to a public hearing, but that's not all the board members. I don't see this as being onerous. I see this as being open, and, you know, I'm very grateful that I live in a town where we have an openness. If we lived in a city like the city that almost surrounds us, the city of Boston, if you lived in a neighborhood, you're going to have trouble hearing your voice, having your voice heard by city agencies that don't do this. And I think we should be grateful to live in a town like Brookline that has public hearings. And anytime I get a chance to vote for a public hearing, I vote for it.
Ms. McNally? Rita McNally? You want to speak? You can come up to the podium in front. Face your constituents.
Thank you. Rita McNally, Precinct 2, and I'm here to speak in favor of Article 5 without either additional amendments. And Jonathan Davis has really spoken to the issue that I wanted to bring up that all of you are aware of, because I see so many of you at different hearings. You're all very committed people, and I know it takes a long period of time. But democracy is about bringing in the people that elect us. And it brought to my attention how intensely people feel in this town when they go from a 9% show up at an election for regular town kinds of issues, and then recently, last Tuesday, when they show up 67 point something %. People are committed when they are called or brought into the process by other people, and there was such tremendous work by people within the town. And to me, this is a whole issue about democracy, just opening the door, letting ordinary citizens in, not just the people that are the small groups of interested people that are always involved in things. So I think that our policymakers really hear from a narrow group most of the time, and sometimes I'm part of that narrow group. But I would like to broaden that and let other people to hear what they have to say, because they also are members of this community as well. No extra meetings were called by the Article 5 is written by Regina and Jonathan Davis. The hearings can be part of the regular meeting that's there, and it's not as if a mob is going to show up. There are only certain issues in this town that bring in huge numbers of people when they feel they haven't been listened to in their own section of our community. So I hope town meeting will vote for fairness and opportunity for the ordinary citizens to be involved. And maybe we as town meeting members need to do a little bit of work letting citizens know what we're talking about and what goes on in sessions such as this. So I hope you will vote for Article 5 as presented on 5-9. Thank you.
Mr. Karen.
John Karen, town meeting member, precinct 12. Having served with Stanley on the advisory committee, I've observed firsthand his commitment to public participation in hearings, so I find myself really surprised that I actually disagree with him on his amendment, but let me tell you why. If I understand the Spiegel amendment correctly, if a board and commission was not to make a recommendation directly to town meeting, in other words, they weren't going to prepare something to be put in the combined reports, they weren't going to have a speaker present to us, their viewpoint could still be presented to town meeting. It just has to be laundered through either a speaker or a member of the advisory committee or the Board of Selectmen. And in fact, I think Stanley in his example said, well, I could, for example, tell the Commission on the Disabled about having a warrant article, and then they take a vote, and I can get up and then on the floor of town meeting say, this commission has voted in favor of this warrant article. Now that is a very powerful argument on the floor of town meeting because we have tremendous respect for our boards and commissions. But in my view, if we're going to consider the viewpoint of a board and commission, whether it's presented in writing to us, whether there's a speaker from that board or commission, or whether their views are simply communicated through a third party, and by the way, if they vote no, you're probably never going to hear what that board and commission said. Let's open it up. Let's make them have a public hearing that they're going to have to have a hearing if they want to vote anyway. The only difference is whether or not somebody else who's not on that board gets to talk. And let's hope that the boards and commissions in town have the same commitment to outreach and getting interested citizens there and communicating that I've seen Stanley Spiegel do when he holds a subcommittee hearing. So I'm going to vote against, and I'd urge you to vote against both amendments and vote in favor of Article 5.
Yes, sir.
Randolph Micklejohn, town meeting member, precinct 5. Just briefly to bring the perspective from another commission, I was the past chair of the Conservation Commission. Again, I'm speaking as a town meeting member. During my tenure as chair, we did consider at least one warrant article where we determined to make a formal recommendation to town meeting. At the time, we were operating under the bylaw, under the policy as we had been given it from the 6th floor. I don't think we would have conducted ourselves any differently under the bylaw, and in either case, we felt and observed to ourselves at the time that conducting ourselves either by the policy or by the proposed bylaw made us more aware of our duty as a public body. And I also happen to be, so I support the advisory committee's motion on the original article. I was also in attendance the evening that Mr. Spiegel went to the Commission for the Disabled, as he summarized and as Mr. Karen described, to go present to them the question that's before town meeting, get their comments and bring them back himself to town meeting. And I don't see how that is really in any way an improvement on the process that we followed on conservation, which we felt was enlightening.
Thank you, Mr. Micklejohn. Seeing nobody else at the microphones, we're ready for a vote. We will vote first on the Rosenthal amendment, which is found on the orange supplement, would replace the second and third paragraphs of the main motion on page 5-9 with his language. Those in favor of the Rosenthal amendment, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion fails. We will next deal with the Spiegel amendment.
Mr. Moderator?
Yes, Mr.
I call
Davis.
for a recorded electronic vote on the Spiegel amendment, please.
Well, if you and 34 other town meeting members call for such a vote, we'll take that. So all those in favor of an electronic vote on the Spiegel amendment, please stand. That's clearly 35, so we will have an electronic vote. This, so the caption is Article 5, Spiegel Amendment. Okay, all those in favor of the Spiegel Amendment, please stand and press 1. Thank you. Those opposed, please stand and press 2. And you may be seated. And again, you can press 1, 2, or 3 at any time during the 40-second cycle. And also note how your vote has been recorded, and if there's any questions about that, let me know. And that concludes the voting. Yes, Dr. Sperber. No, sir, I can't. I'm afraid I can't change the timing. It's embedded in the system.
Mr. Moderator?
Mr. Burstein?
Michael Burstein, Precinct 12. I don't know if this is a point of personal privilege. I understand about the tradition of standing for these votes. I personally find standing while trying to read how I and my colleagues voted on the screen more distracting than if you would just allow us to sit and push the buttons.
Well, if there's a overwhelming sentiment favoring your position, Mr. Burstein,
I'd like an electronic recorded vote for that. Oh, no, just... But.
I missed the
Well, I'd rather have everybody say. I mean,
the Spiegel motion fails by a vote of 76 in favor, 135 against, and 5 abstentions. On the main motion,
Mr. Moderator?
Mr. Davis?
I'm sorry, but I would like to ask for a recorded electronic vote on the main motion.
There is absolutely no need for an apology. That's what we have this system for. If there are 35 town meeting members who would like a electronic vote, we'll have one on the motion, main motion on page 5-9, and there are 35 plus town meeting members. Whenever you're ready, it's Article 5, main motion. Okay, you may now cast your votes. Those in favor, please stand and press 1. Those, you may be seated. Those opposed, please stand and press 2. Thank you. You may be seated, and We'll run through the last 20 seconds of the voting period, and please note how your vote has been recorded. The voting period is over. Motion carries by a vote of 164 in favor, 48 against, and 5 abstentions.
Mr. Moderator?
Yes, Mr. Rosenthal.
I don't know if you'd accept a motion to reconsider on Article 4, which I voted for, but I think it's subsumed by Article 5, and having two different places in the bylaws is actually confusing to people.
Well, A, I won't take a motion to reconsider unless you follow the procedures in the town meeting handbook. B, the experts on these two articles have advised me, and it's my own observation, that there is substantial duplication between the two, but there are at least one element of Article 4 which is different from Article 5, so I won't take that motion. We proceed to Article 6. The motion under Article 6 is for no action. Moved by Mr. Wyszynski, seconded by Mr. Bors. On the motion for no action, those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Article 7. The motion of the petitioner under Article 7 is found on the pink supplement, page 3, that the town adopt the following resolution relating to the regulation of foreclosures and mediation. Moved by Marilise, seconded by Mr. Bors. Marilise?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening. I'm Marilise, town meeting member from Precinct 6 and lead petitioner of this resolution to support the concept of pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation. My remarks tonight and your decision have been greatly simplified since I first submitted this warrant article as a new and very complex Brookline bylaw. In the normal vetting process that every warrant article is subject to, I learned a lot about our town and who does what, and concluded that the bylaw was not ready for prime time. And I thank the many conscientious town boards, committees, volunteers for your careful consideration and suggestions. Quiet as it may be kept, the foreclosure crisis hasn't gone away. In fact, thousands of Massachusetts homeowners are still at risk, which translates into families at risk, neighborhoods at risk, and indeed our economic recovery at risk. This is a problem that I've been engaged in for 5 years, primarily as a steering committee member of the Massachusetts Alliance Against Predatory Lending, or what we simply call MAPLE. The 3 founding organizations of MAPLE were Greater Boston Legal Services, City Life Vida Urbana, which has gotten national media coverage for its eviction blockades, and the Green Rainbow Party. Today, MAPLE is a statewide coalition of approximately 70 housing counseling agencies, legal services groups, social service agencies, and social action groups that have joined together to address the foreclosure crisis in Massachusetts, a crisis that is created not just by subprime mortgages, but also by other predatory and fraudulent lending practices. MAPLE's main focus for the last 4 years has been on state legislation, something that Representative Frank Smisek has worked with us on. He has sponsored legislation that would have Massachusetts join all the other New England states, in implementing mortgage mediation programs. But the Commonwealth hasn't yet managed to get this passed, despite vast support from legislators. So while Maple will again submit legislation, we are also pursuing another path, getting a critical mass of cities and towns to pass local ordinances, bylaws, and resolutions to influence action on Beacon Hill. Representative Smisek supports this effort and this resolution, as does JALSA, the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, which has also worked to alleviate the impact of the mortgage crisis. Perhaps you saw the letter written by JALSA's president and fellow town meeting member, Andrew Fisher, that appeared in Thursday's Brookline tab. The point to remember is that mortgage mediation, which would be paid for by the lending institution, has a clear record of benefiting both the lender and the homeowner. It has led to a high percentage of mutually agreed upon loan modifications and other better alternatives to foreclosure. It's true that Brookline itself is fortunate. Foreclosures are relatively few, property values have remained strong. That could lead us to think that poverty is not an issue in Brookline, whereas we learned in the 2010 census that Brookline's poverty rate actually is higher than the state average. And no one has been exempt from the struggling economy. Many retirement plans are still in recovery. I'm not going to read each whereas in the resolution, but I will repeat this one. Whereas it appears that towns and cities throughout the Commonwealth
You have 1 minute.
need to convey an urgent message to all levels of government that emergency action is needed. I single out this one because the sense of urgency that is not being sufficiently felt. And I single it out because of the fact that Brookline can provide a leadership role. I urge favorable action as follows. Therefore, be it resolved that Brookline supports the concept of statewide pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation under appropriate circumstances and considers this resolution an important step in joining other cities and towns to advance and advocate for its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franco. And Mr. Blood, would you please come forward? Mr. Blood, come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and through you to the body. Ben Franco for the majority of the Advisory Committee. A vote of favorable action on Article 7 would pass a resolution expressing the town meeting's support for the concept of pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation and town meeting's willingness to join other cities and towns in advocating for the implementation of a pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation program. When Article 7 was first submitted, it proposed the adoption of a bylaw specific to the town of Brookline. During the process that leads up to town meeting, concern was raised about the appropriateness of a bylaw to address the topic at hand. There was, however, general support for action, and that is the reason that a proposal for a bylaw was dropped and replaced with a resolution. To be clear, this body is being asked to vote on passage of a resolution which supports the concept of pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation and which calls for statewide action and not any binding action specific to the town of Brookline. Pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation is a process that requires lenders to offer borrowers the opportunity to work with a trained mediator to attempt to restructure or otherwise modify a mortgage on terms that reflect the current financial situation of the borrower. The goal of pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation is to avoid an outcome where the borrower loses their home to foreclosure. As you've heard from the petitioner, the resolution before this body is part of a larger effort by the Massachusetts Alliance Against Predatory Lending, MAPLE. MAPLE is seeking passage of a bill at the State House that would allow Massachusetts mortgage borrowers to opt into a statewide pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation program. This bill has not been passed into law. It is argued that town meeting's passage of a resolution, along with action by municipal government elsewhere in the Commonwealth, will apply the necessary pressure on the legislature to ensure eventual passage of Maple's bill. During the adjudicatory process this fall, some in town expressed concern about the impact that passage of Article 7 would have upon the housing and mortgage markets in Brookline. The argument goes that lenders would be less inclined to write a mortgage in Brookline, or would do so only at a higher cost because of the additional specific burden a mediation program would introduce to Brookline's housing market, should the foreclosure process need to be initiated. The majority of the advisory committee did not find merit in this argument for two reasons. One, the proposal currently before town meeting is a resolution which would convey support for pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation, but would not require it to occur. And two, the resolution does not call for action specific to the town of Brookline. In short, a favorable vote would not directly establish a pre-foreclosure mortgage mediation program in Brookline, and therefore the Brookline foreclosure process would not differ from that in surrounding communities. Others have argued against Article 7, saying that there is no foreclosure crisis in Brookline, and therefore no action by the town is required. It is true that Brookline has only seen an average of 9 foreclosures per year over the past 5 years, and that in cases where a foreclosure has occurred, the impact upon neighborhoods and the town's finances has been negligible because of the strength of Brookline's housing market. However, the advisory committee believes the passage of this resolution is an opportunity to express our support for our sister communities who have been adversely affected by the foreclosure crisis. Therefore, by a vote of 14 in favor, 4 opposed, and 1 abstention, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on Article 7, as found on page 3 of the pink supplement.
Thank you, Mr. Blood.
Roger Blood, town meeting member, precinct 13, and chair of the Housing Advisory Board. Because the subject matter of Article 7 involves housing policy at the municipal level, the Housing Advisory Board held an early public meeting with extended dialogue with the petitioners, as well as a public hearing with input from 1 member of the public. The board unanimously reached several conclusions and 1 recommendation regarding the article as it was originally brought before the Housing Advisory Board. First of all, that the topic of the article and the goals of the petitioners were such that the Housing Advisory Board completely supported them in the sense of sending a message to the state and drawing attention to the problems that people have had with the foreclosure crisis, the suffering that's caused, in particular as it's been a result of predatory lending in various parts of the state, though not necessarily a great deal in Brookline as well as across the country. The article, as you just heard, as originally presented, would have required the town to, under a bylaw, a binding bylaw, to establish an administrative mechanism at the local level and to assure that each individual foreclosure was monitored and managed in compliance with the requirements for mediation between lender and borrower, as well as a number of other requirements. The HAB felt that first of all, the need at the local level had not been adequately demonstrated in terms of the frequency of foreclosure or the adverse impact on either homeowners, borrowers, or neighborhoods. And second of all, that the purposes of the petitioners would be better served with a resolution, such as you now have before you, whereby any such mechanism as might eventually be properly adopted at the state level would involve resources and administrative procedures that would be the responsibility and the resources of the state as opposed to our town government. So we were very pleased to see the process resulted in migration of this proposal from a binding bylaw to what we think is a very good resolution, and the Housing Advisory Board urges favorable action on it as you now have it before you. Thank you.
Mr. Goldstein.
Thank you and good evening. Ken Goldstein for a unanimous Board of Selectmen.
I'm going to speak to you also as a practicing real estate attorney in town. First of all, I want to thank the petitioner, Marilise, for bringing this important subject to our attention. There is a mortgage foreclosure crisis in the state and in the country. Brookline has fortunately avoided it, but in communities that are less fortunate than our own, you would find that if you came to me for advice about what to expect because you were underwater in your mortgage, I and other real estate professionals would be at a loss to give you proper guidance. The institutional mortgage lenders have been running roughshod over this process. There are no standards, there's no predictability, and as a result, it's very inefficient, and people are losing a lot more than they need to, as well as lenders losing more than they need to. So the basic idea at the core of this, which is mediation, required mediation, is a good one, and one that I support and that the Board of Selectmen supports as well. I do want to point out some flaws with the original article. I know it's not before you, but tonight it could be in the future. But I want to make sure people understand why the original article was inappropriate at this time.
Well, you know, Mr. Goldstein, it isn't before us.
I understand completely,
And
but
make your remarks brief, if you will.
they will be very brief. So the first point is that the mediation process is a process for experts. It's not something that the town has experience with. It's not something that we can necessarily budget for, and it requires people who are trained mediators, trained real estate professionals to properly administer. The other problem that I have with this is it's overly broad. It applies to the foreclosure of all mortgages. The problem is institutional mortgages. Institutional lenders are the ones who are running roughshod over consumers. Some attorneys know that we use mortgages for a lot of purposes, from family transactions, business transactions. There's even things called performance mortgages, which don't involve any monetary exchange at all, and it's not fair to require this extra process for people who are not involved in that. There was another part of the proposal too, which is that there was some requirements for the upkeep and maintenance of properties after foreclosure. This is a problem in other communities, not a problem in Brookline. We've got bylaws on the books, state statutes and codes that cover that as well. So again, summarizing, we, the Board of Selectmen, support the resolution that's been proposed, and we look forward to a state mediation program in the future. Unanimous Board of Selectmen recommends favorable action on the resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Andrew Fisher, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13. I also serve as the president of JALSA, the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, and as a practicing attorney, I've had occasion to be, and in my capacity with JALSA, to be exposed to some of the horrors of the foreclosure problem as it affects ordinary people like ourselves and citizens of Brookline. I'm going to try and be brief, but I do want to give one example. A woman who called me recently with a mortgage foreclosure problem. She normally pays her property taxes. She paid her property taxes. The mortgage the company that managed the mortgage company for one of the banks that was too big to fail erroneously paid her property taxes. So they had been paid twice. She went to the town and tried to get a refund. Then they said, "Well, we'll give you credit for next year's taxes, but we won't give you your money back." The mortgage company then took her next mortgage payment and applied it to the taxes that they had paid on her behalf, and placed her in default on her mortgage. And now that she was in default in her mortgage, she was accruing penalties and extra interest. So that, and each payment that she made, she was falling further behind because they weren't being applied to her mortgage, they were being applied to the arrearages. The frustrating part was that there was nobody she could talk to. Every time she called, she got someone different after going through the phone tree. Every person she talked to gave her a different response, gave her a different amount as to what they claimed she was owed, and she's now in foreclosure. What this mediation program would do would be, and her problem is not an uncommon problem. And you know, we're talking, this is not a woman who took a fast loan that she couldn't afford. It's a mortgage she's had for 11 or 12 or some number of years. It's the family home. There are many people like this in situations that are not predatory. We're not talking about predatory lending. We're talking about a bank that's too big to fail means the bank is too big to care. And there's no way effectively to reach these banks. What a mediation program would do would force the bank, before it could foreclose, to send someone who knew the situation and who had the authority to sit down and deal with the woman. What is found almost universally is that a mediation program results in a win-win. It very often takes a situation and by rewriting the mortgage or by fixing these kind of problems allows a non-performing loan to become a performing loan. So in the end, what they find is the mediation program is good for the bank as well as good for the homeowner. But you can't get there without requiring the bank to do so. For this reason, JALSA has supported, and I support, the notion of a mediation program, and I'm hoping that we can not only support this, the resolution as proposed, but be back here in the spring with a well-vetted and functional mediation program so that Brookline can serve as a model and Brookline can serve to propel the state towards the action that should be taken on this and other actions to protect borrowers and homeowners from predatory banks. Thank you.
Thank you. On the motion on the pink supplement, that the town adopt the resolution relating to mortgage pre-foreclosure mediation. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, raise your hands. The motion carries by a vote of 212 to 3. Before we proceed to Article 8, I'd like to ask your indulgence for just a moment. I'd like a show of hands of those of you who feel that the process of standing to cast your electronic vote is helpful. Okay, let's see how many of you think it doesn't add anything material to your... Okay. I think we're going to abandon that process. On to Article 8. Now, Article 8 is a little complicated, at least when you throw in the various proposed amendments, so please pay close attention to my explanation, which I hope will be lucid. The main motion is a motion in the words of the article on page 8-1. In order to convert the article to a motion, it would read, moved that the town amend, etc., the general bylaws as follows, and the words at the end of the article or act on anything relative thereto will be stricken. That motion is made by Ms. Heller. Is there a second? Motion is seconded. The advisory committee would add at the end of the first paragraph the language found on page 5 of the green supplement, the sentence, "This provision shall not apply to the packaging of uncooked meat, uncooked poultry, and/or uncooked fish. That's moved by Ms. Khan, seconded by Mr. Bors, and again, that's a sentence that would be added by the advisory committee to the end of the first paragraph. Now come the selectmen. If you turn to page 2 of the green supplement, there are 2 additions that the selectmen would make to the main motion. First, after the words effective December 1, 2013, comma, polystyrene, the selectmen would add foam, paren, expanded or, quote, blown polystyrene, close paren. And in the second paragraph of the main motion, at the beginning of the third line, the word containers, the selectmen would modify that by adding the word foam. And I'm sure they'll explain the rationale to these proposals. That's moved by Ms. Mermel, seconded by Ms. DeWitt. Ms. Heller.
Good evening, Nancy Heller, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 8, and petitioner of this article. A few months ago, I was in Great Barrington and stopped at a Dunkin' Donuts and ended up with a cup that looks like this, this brown cup. Asked why, was told that there's a law in Great Barrington because I'd always got my Dunkin' Donuts in a foam cup. Opposed as I was to foam because of its environmental detriments, I began to do some research. Found out that that 22 years ago, Great Barrington enacted an ordinance or a bylaw that prohibits the use of polystyrene containers in food and beverage to go. They did exempt uncooked meat, poultry, and fish because at that time, I believe, there were not very many alternative containers. As I did more research, I found out that there are bans popping up all over, mostly in the West, actually. And many of those initial ones especially were for the expanded foam. But as the effects of the environmental effects and also health information has come forth, more communities are adopting a total ban. 17 months ago, the National Institute for Environmental Health Services, which is a department of U.S., branch of the U.S. Health and Human Services, put styrene, which is the principal component of polystyrene, on the list of likely carcinogens. The studies have involved mostly toxicity to workers, and there are some suggestions from some studies that when you put hot food or oily or greasy food in the containers, that there may be some leaching. There must be more studies. It's very clear that there have not been yet enough, but it seems to me that the environmental effects are reason enough to ban this stuff. The environmental consequences are very significant. Polystyrene is noxious to make. Once produced, both the expanded and the rigid types don't biodegrade. Some estimate they're around for 500 years or more, and they rather crumble. They break easily into fragments. They blow from trash cans. People drop them. This is what they can look like pretty easily. You just squeeze this is a rigid one. And if they're strewn as trash onto land or water, including rivers like the Muddy River, they have an indefinite life. They could break into microscopic pieces that choke and clog animal digestive systems, especially when animals peck at them because they think they might be food there. They get little pieces of it. Product remains indefinitely in landfills, takes up more space than paper, especially the foam, and eventually re-enters the environment when landfills are breached by water or mechanical forces. And as the polystyrene breaks up, it can also leach its noxious chemicals into the environment. As a petroleum product, polystyrene is not made from a renewable resource, and even though we throw this thing, which is a number 6, and we're allowed to throw this in, we're not allowed to throw in the foam into our bins, what happens to it when it gets to the waste management facility is it gets incinerated. So in fact, it's really just trash. And this is apparently what happens in many communities to number 6. The other numbers have different results.
You have 1 minute.
I thought you were going to give me 10.
Sorry?
I thought I had 10 minutes.
I don't recall you're asking for 10 minutes, and I haven't allowed the opponents 10 minutes, but go ahead, Ms. Heller. Try to finish as quickly as possible.
So these are single-use containers. You can't microwave in them. That could be harmful. And unlike 22 years ago, there are now many alternatives. Packaging companies are furiously trying to develop greener types, and some are cost competitive. Alternatives are other plastics, numbers 1 and 5, aluminum containers, or biodegradable packaging. Several years ago, especially the biodegradable stuff is much more expensive. Now it's come down in price. Aluminum containers are now pretty much equal to the foam ones, and they actually are recycled and recyclable. When they go to the recycling facility, they are turned into something else because they're metal. Online, you'll see that the price differences don't exist between the foam and the aluminum. In terms of the rigid stuff, I found hot cup lids, which are also priced very competitively with lids that are made from compostable materials. So there's really no need to not ban this stuff as well, because there are so many alternatives. Now, as far as meat, poultry, and fish go, there are also lots of alternatives. Butchers can all wrap in paper. In Great Barrington, one small grocery has a machine which vacuum packs the meat, and that's also used at the meat house. The meat house manager says meat's preserved longer and better, it stays fresher, it freezes better, it is more economical because after the initial outlay for the machine, the manager in the meat house and in Great Barrington said they saved lots of money over the styrofoam packaging. The manager at the meat house says our packaging is not styrofoam. He believes that the customers really, really appreciate that. There are also compostable kinds of trays from meat. Now these are, I assume, are more expensive. It was hard for me to get a handle on it, but they are cellulose. If they end up in the environment and an animal pecks at it and gets a bit of it, it's not going to die because this is cellulose and they eat. It's a food-based product. I spoke today with John Rodnicki, who is a restaurant supply company salesman, and he's confirmed that these cost things that I've been telling you about. And he says that actually the rigid polystyrene, this stuff, is more expensive than number 5. Well, you get that number 5 containers in your, a lot of Chinese restaurants use them. They're black and they have a clear plastic top. Another reason to ban all polystyrene is that whether rigid or foam, it's marked with a recycled symbol 6. If we only ban the expanded foam, the task of figuring it out is much more difficult for merchants, consumers, and our health inspectors. And it will be much clearer and cleaner if we ban everything that has a number 6 on it. Another point to remember, an important point, is that this ban applies only to food that is packaged within the town. And Trader Joe's does not package within the town, but does use a lot of number 5. But things like kosher chicken, which come from the Empire Company in polystyrene trays, would not be affected by this. We cannot run afoul of the Interstate Commerce Clause, and can only make the rules about what happens in Brookline. I consulted with Dr. Balsam on the development of this article, and he advised that We have a long waiting period before the bylaw becomes effective, so that's in December of 2013, more than a year away. The reason is that, as with trans fat, there will be an education of merchants and consumers and health inspectors. Businesses need time to use up their supplies, and they need time to figure out which alternatives they prefer. Director of Health in Brookline would be charged with enforcement, and he can also waive the requirement for hardship or economic reasons. He could waive just the one on polystyrene foam trays for meat if he so chose to with a particular vendor. Now the Massachusetts...
So you have 1 minute.
All right. I was going to point out that the Massachusetts Food Association and Dunkin' Donuts have also written you letters. I would just point out that they do have facilities in communities which have banned this plastic, and those operations, like the Dunkin' Donuts in Great Barrington or the Stop and Shop in Nantucket, do fine, and they may operate on a different system and cups and trays, etc., but they do just fine. Starbucks also operates here very successfully with paper cups. Just to address one quickly, the motion of the
30 seconds.
The selectmen originally voted. They voted unanimously for their version, but both Selectman Mermel and Selectman Daley had signaled that they would have supported the main motion. And that was true at the advisory committee as well. Several members said that they would have supported, although not a majority, several members said that they would support the full version. And I urge you to do that and ban all polystyrene. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Khan. And would Christine Riley and Ray Ehrlich please come forward and sit in the front row? Ms. Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Janice Khan, town meeting member from Precinct 15, speaking for the advisory committee. So first of all, I'd like to draw your attention to the blue revised supplement. This is what, it's only slightly revised from the green one, but you should know that this is the more final version of the advisory committee recommendation.
But it doesn't change the language of your amendment.
Does not change the language or anything, right. It's just tweaks. Warrant Article 8 is being presented to town meeting in 3 variations. Variation 1, the petitioner of this article is seeking a ban on polystyrene-based disposable food containers in both the expanded styrofoam type and its more rigid plastic form, number 6 plastics, all. The second variation is the advisory committee recommendation, which includes an exclusion for trays for uncooked meat, poultry, or fish. And variation 3, the Board of Selectmen recommends that the ban retreat 1 step more and restrict the ban to only the expanded foam type polystyrene. Essentially, the difference between the advisory committee recommendation and that of the Board of Selectmen is coffee cup lids made of number 6 plastic. So it's to ban or not to ban them. So how did the advisory committee reach its recommendation? There were 3 central issues: potential health hazards, environmental impacts, and availability of alternative food container products. First, health. As you've heard, the potential health hazard is from styrene, the major chemical component of polystyrene. Trapped within the solid product, styrene is not a potential health risk. But if it gets released, for instance, when it comes in contact with hot liquids, it may be. The 12th report on carcinogens, published last year by the National Toxicology Program of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, notes that styrene is reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. That concern arises from occupational exposures to styrene in the workplace, in the fabrication of boat, automobile, truck parts, for example, where workers were found to have high levels of styrene and suffered neurological symptoms and increased risks for leukemia and lymphoma, though no causal relationship has been established. There is also experimental data from laboratory studies with mice in which styrene exposures caused lung tumors. On the other hand, Ray Ehrlich, the regional manager of Dart Container Corporation, in his letter to town meeting members just today, is correct in stating that there is no clear scientific evidence that styrene causes negative health effects in people. More research is needed. It should be noted that Dart Container Corporation manufactures many single-use polystyrene food containers, including solo styrofoam coffee cups and lids. But it also manufactures alternative plastic food containers made from PET or PETE, #1 plastics, a plastic resin, and a form of polyester. So
We'll hear from Mr. Ehrlich shortly, so maybe you don't want to steal any of his thunder.
Which is easily recycled and reused. Second, environmental. There are two concerns here. The petitioner mentioned them. One is that the polystyrene #6 plastic often ends up in landfills where it lasts indefinitely. And two, that polystyrene packaging is a particularly serious threat to marine wildlife. That's why most of the bylaws that have been passed, or the most municipalities that have banned polystyrene, actually are in California, where this is a critical issue for them. It kills marine wildlife. In Brookline, #6 plastics make up about 1% of the trash in our recycling bins.
You have 1 minute.
But it's not recycled. Instead, it's transferred to recycling centers where it's incinerated. Third, viable alternatives. There are viable alternatives to polystyrene. And the letter from Dunkin' Donuts noted that it's a #1 priority to find these alternatives, which do exist. And Great Barrington, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, and Rahway, New Jersey, for instance, those franchises, Dunkin' Donuts franchises, have
30 seconds.
Have complied with the ordinance. The budgetary impact on the town of passing this warrant article would be an additional $24,000 to hire a part-time inspector with no benefits within the health department, which would be charged with enforcement of this, in addition to the recently enacted other bylaws, trans fats, daycare centers, crated veal, for instance. So it's not just this bylaw. And it should be noted that businesses, as the petitioner said, would have a year and potentially 2 years to comply. Therefore, by a vote of 17 in favor, 1 opposed, and 2 abstentions, the advisory committee recommends passing the petitioner's article banning polystyrene-based disposable food containers with an exemption for trays for uncooked meat, poultry, and fish when the packaging takes place on the premises of food service establishments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Riley. Ms. Riley is representing Dunkin' Donuts, and I've told her that she can speak to us as a matter of right, given the interest of her franchises in this proposal. Ms. Riley?
Thank you. Good evening. I am Christine Riley. I am the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility for Dunkin' Brands, which is the parent company and franchisor of both Dunkin' Donuts and Baskin-Robbins, and I appreciate the opportunity to share our opposition to or concerns to the polystyrene ban being considered this evening. During my short statement, I would like to share a few key points. Banning polystyrene will not reduce waste or increase recycling in the town of Brookline. The use of polystyrene packaging does not pose a health threat to consumers. And the proposed ordinance will have a detrimental impact on Brookline's small business owners. Dunkin' Donuts has been working very hard for the past several years to find a replacement for our foam cup that will truly be better for guests, for our franchisees, and for the environment. And I can tell you firsthand that if that existed, we would be using it. Many in our industry have worked on this problem to date and have not discovered a straightforward substitution to polystyrene. People often assume that the simple answer is to switch from paper or from foam to paper cups. But as I think many have said here tonight, paper cups are not recyclable in the vast majority of communities due to the leak-resistant plastic lining, which is to say that you cannot throw paper cups, including Starbucks paper cup, in your blue recycling bin. Most biodegradable and compostable alternatives out there are not biodegradable and compostable in your backyard composting bins. They must be, like foam and like paper cups, they must go to a commercial facility to be biodegraded or composted. Thus, a polystyrene ban will not reduce or eliminate waste or increase recycling. In fact, it will simply replace one type of trash with another, resulting in more waste in the Brookline trash system, or at least an equivalent amount. Second, we are very concerned with the characterization of polystyrene as a health threat to consumers. While the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has listed styrene as an anticipated carcinogen, the same agency explicitly states that, quote, styrene should not be confused with polystyrene, close quote, explaining that their listing was based on, quote, high levels of exposure, such as that experienced by workers exposed to styrene in an industrial setting, close quote. The agency does go on to clarify that there is no health risk associated with products served in polystyrene containers, and I can assure you that Dunkin' Donuts and Dunkin' Brands overall is committed to the food safety of all of our products, including all of our hot beverages that are served in polystyrene. I urge you to visit the website of the report on carcinogens that is cited by Ms. Heller for further clarification on this issue. Finally, banning polystyrene will increase costs for small business owners, consumers, and the town of Brookline. There are 5 Dunkin' Donuts shops in Brookline. All of them are 100% owned and operated by local franchisees. Shifting from the current foam cup to paper cup will increase costs by over 50% for these franchisees. You not only need to instead replace the foam cup with a paper cup, you often have to replace that with a sleeve in order to protect the hand from the heat that is radiating from the paper cup. You don't have that situation with a foam cup. So you are adding an additional cost there. That's an additional $10,000 per year per store for each of our franchisees, stores in this community. Other restaurants will face similar increases, and they will be forced to pass these on to the consumers in higher prices in an already difficult economy. In addition, forcing a switch from polystyrene, which is 90% air, to heavier materials like paper will increase the weight and volume of trash that the town must pay to manage. And the cardboard sleeves or the additional cup that people often like to use to protect their hand from the hot cup will also increase waste and waste disposal costs.
1 minute.
Thank you. Finding an alternative to the polystyrene foam cup, as I've said, is our company's #1 sustainability priority. We are taking a holistic approach to this. We have an internal cup team that is working with our suppliers, industry peers, and internal and external experts to evaluate technologies and see if there is something that will meet the demands of our guests, of our franchisees, and of the environment. We are also working to minimize waste across all of our packaging materials. We have reduced the weight of our foam and plastic cups to eliminate 4.6 million pounds of waste annually.
30 seconds.
We have switched to 100% post-consumer fiber napkin. We are launching an in-store foam cup recycling program, pilot test this fall, and we have created a hot and cold reusable mug program that is an option for our franchisees, and we invite you to bring your reusable mug into our shops. While this is not a perfect solution, we think these examples do demonstrate our commitment to finding a viable, sustainable alternative to polystyrene foam. And in conclusion, I would like to reiterate our opposition to the polystyrene ban in Brookline and urge you to vote no on Article 8. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Mermel.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Jessie Mermel for the Board of Selectmen. At this point, you are all, no doubt, very familiar with the many health and environmental hazards from polystyrene, so I will spare you a repeat of that explanation and move on to saying that the Board of Selectmen shares the petitioner's concerns about the negative impact that these products can have on our residents, our community, and our world. We have made 2 amendments to the article with an eye toward making this transition as beneficial as possible to the town while still being manageable for our business community. The amendments are as follows. 1, polystyrene is specifically defined as being the blown or expanded polystyrene, what we think of as styrofoam. The hard polystyrene, or what you get is the lid on your food takeout containers, would not be included in the ban. Foam polystyrene is not recyclable and clogs our landfills. Hard polystyrene is collected with recyclables in Brookline and is either turned back into energy through a waste-to-energy plant or is recycled when there is a market for the product. And second, like the ban in Great Barrington on which the petitioner's proposal was based, we propose that the ban not extend to trays used for uncooked meat, poultry, or fish. The board feels that there is an additional public health concern at play related to the packaging and distribution of these products, such as leakage or spoilage. In addition, suitable replacements for these containers seem to be hard to come by, unlike replacements for the containers of other items. For example, Whole Foods, which has successfully transitioned many of their product containers to more environmentally and health-friendly alternatives, has been unable to find an appropriate alternative for these uses, particularly related to pre-packaged uncooked meats. Personally, I'm optimistic that the market for these more responsible containers will improve in the future, but we aren't there yet. The board is confident that the year-long lead-up period outlined in the article is adequate for the education and planning necessary for implementing such a ban, and is also confident that the health department, having been through a similar process with the trans fat ban, is well situated to manage such a process. With that, the board thanks the petitioner for bringing the article forward, and with a vote of 4-1, the one being Selectman Daley, who supports the petitioner's version, urges favorable action on the article as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Ehrlich. Mr. Ehrlich, representing Dart Industries, and I've advised him, as I did Ms. Riley, that he's entitled as a matter of right to address us, and you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, Brookline Town members. My name is Ray Ehrlich, and I work for Dart Container Corporation. And I'm appearing before you tonight to urge you to urge your opposition to the proposed polystyrene ban, Article 8. As a brief introduction, Dart Container Corporation has been a manufacturer of foam and non-foam food service products, mainly polystyrene, for over 50 years, for more than 50 years. And because a tremendous amount of misinformation, myths, and misperceptions are out there about our products or these products and the environment, we established a department in our company 25 years ago that helps promote and educate on the realities and the facts about the environment and food service products, especially polystyrene. The main point I want to make tonight is that the issue before us, or the issues before us, are rather scientific in nature and very technical, and I would just urge and say that it's vitally important that the information used to collect and base recommendations, that this information be credible, accurate, meaningful, and comprehensive. And having said that, I urge you to consider the following factual information regarding the environmental performance and the safety of polystyrene foam, a lot of which Christine has just mentioned. First, regarding product bans, in reality, product bans do not effectively reduce litter or the waste that's produced. Essentially, what product bans do is substitute one product for another. When you think about it, people will not stop drinking coffee on the go, will not stop buying hamburgers from McDonald's. They will do that in a different material. If you ban polystyrene, there will still be material in the waste, there will still be litter, so essentially you're swapping one for the other. Regarding solid waste, according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and this has been documented for many years, polystyrene foam food service products make up less than 1% of the waste that's disposed of in this country, both by weight and by volume. In addition, there's misinformation about landfills. Landfills 50 years ago may have been unregulated dump sites, but since the passage of RCRA in 1976, landfills today are highly managed, they're highly engineered, they're highly regulated. They are designed to entomb waste. They're not designed to be compost piles. Their goal is to maintain the waste so it doesn't decompose and create methane and leachate that can foul the air and water. So really, it's a benefit to put non-compostable or non-biodegradable materials in the landfill. Regarding recycling, polystyrene is a thermoplastic. It's 100% recyclable. Is it recycled? Yes, it is, in a limited basis when you compare it to mixed paper or aluminum cans, of course. Food service is a unique product. It has a lot of food contamination, liquid contamination, and also when you think about it, these materials leave the premise or leave the place that they're sold, and so only about 20% of the material stays on premise. The rest goes out, and it's hard to collect. It's different to generate the volume to collect. But having said that, recycling of foam, polystyrene foam is actually, polystyrene foam food service containers are the most recycled food service container of any material. Like Christine said, paper cups are lined with polyethylene to contain the liquids, and they are not accepted in municipal recycling programs. Lastly, I would like to comment on the health and safety issues that have been raised. Please know that food packaging is carefully designed to be effective in preventing food spoilage and contamination while having limited transfer of its components or its component substances to the food it contacts, and is subject to an extensive pre-market, before it ever comes to market, approval process by several agencies, including the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Bottom line is these products have been used for more than half a century. There's never been one documented case of anyone being harmed by using a polystyrene foam cup or container. It's nonsense. It really is. Now, the NTP report regards styrene, and yes, the report was misrepresented in a lot of media outlets to refer to it as polystyrene, but please know that styrene and polystyrene are two fundamentally different things. Styrene is a liquid, polystyrene is a solid made from styrene. They're chemically different, analogous to chlorine and sodium. When you put them together, you get sodium chloride. I mean, you get table salt. So you really have to understand, I think, the specifics of the scientific research. And to a lot of lay people, myself included, I'm not a toxicologist.
You have 1 minute.
But the point is that the NTP report deals with styrene. The NTP itself, the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, and the toxicologist who heads both groups, Dr. Linda Birnbaum, PhD, was widely quoted at the time the report came out saying that these reports do not apply to the end products, including polystyrene foam. So in conclusion, DART, as a responsible corporate citizen that's been making these products and recovering them and recycling them for decades, shares and supports your efforts to reduce litter, reduce waste. We agree, marine litter and litter, these materials should not be disposed of in that manner. They should be recycled or disposed of properly. We appreciate being allowed to be part of this process, and what I would ask is that we be given the opportunity with other stakeholders and involved parties to work with town officials to come up with maybe a more rational, more effective method or solution to dealing with solid waste and litter problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gilman. And Mr. Hall, would you come forward, please? No, Ms. Gilman, you're next.
Good evening. My name is Jane Gilman. I'm from Precinct 3, and I'm speaking...
A little closer to the mic, please. I'm sorry? Get closer to the microphone.
Closer to the mic. Is that
Yep.
better? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ehrlich.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator, Board of Selectmen, Advisory Committee, and my colleagues. I'm speaking on behalf... My name is Jane Gilman. Jane Gilman from Precinct 3. Speaking on behalf of the Green Caucus. Rather than repeat some of the comments you've already heard, I just want to make a few short points. First of all, I want to thank the lobbyists who are here tonight. I always learn when I listen to experts, and I thank you for coming to our meeting. The Green Caucus voted unanimously to endorse the original article as proposed by Ms. Heller, that would ban all polystyrene products. I want to call your attention to the display that Ms. Heller placed in the back of the auditorium in the lobby with enormous quantities of substitutes for plastic that is currently used in Brookline and across the world. We are actually drowning in plastic products of all forms. They float around us, they are under our feet, they're in our waterways and in our trees. The plastic industry wants us to keep these in circulation. I ask you, what did we do before plastic? Now, we did have a cultural change here. We have a takeout culture. So the question becomes, how do we meet the challenge of providing on-the-go food to myself and others? there are reasonable solutions. They are used in communities all over the world, and I'm not aware of any business that has folded because they've had to use plastic, they've had to stop using plastic and use substitutes instead. Plastics become a way of life, but with a little imagination, I think we can answer the question, what did we do before plastic? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. And Mr. Solomon, would you please come forward and sit in the front row?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is John Hall, Precinct 15. I'm not a scientist, and I haven't got a dog in this hunt. I don't own any Dunkin' Donuts, and I only have one as a tenant, and that store's not in Brookline. I was sort of disappointed last spring. We were talking about leaf blowers, and to me, it seemed to me that if my neighbor started running his leaf blower at 6 o'clock in the morning, that perhaps I could persuade him by sticking my head out the window and saying, hey, try it at 9:30, rather than have us legislate leaf blowers into some certain period of the year. It seems to me that as government, we're beginning to perhaps overreach. I sort of feel the same, thank you guys, I sort of feel the same way here. All of a sudden, if somebody doesn't want to drink coffee out of a styrofoam cup, and I like styrofoam cups because they're usually in a hurry and I don't like burning my hands, all they have to do is vote with their feet. It is find some place where you can get 2 paper cups, which will add more trash, etc., and then you won't burn your hands and you won't have to drink out of a styrofoam cup. And I also think that, you know, there's a lot of stuff running around here. All of a sudden, half of us are going to get cancer if we drink out of styrofoam. Well, it's just not true. It's been around too long, and there are plenty of studies. Now, I would not have a styrene cocktail. I think that would be a little stupid. But I think we can continue to drink out of polystyrene cups. Now, I don't know a whole lot about the environment either, but I will tell you that, well, I'm being honest, okay? Polystyrene is easy to make. It's easier to make than paper, and it has a lot less of a carbon footprint than paper. So if you look at the picture on a large scale, our biggest problem environmentally is our carbon footprints, and this product makes less of it than does paper or other potential materials you might use. Secondly, if we had a landfill, we would be worrying about methane, and methane is a greener, whatever they call it, the green, keeping the green in, problem than CO2. So methane is not a good gas, and we don't have a landfill. We happen to burn our trash, and which is not recycled, and when we burn it, it so happens that polystyrene is a more effective fire starter and burns brighter and harder and warmer than does paper. So in fact, from an environmental point of view there, it is also helpful. What have I missed here? Well, if I missed something, I'm sorry. But I guess the last thing I would say to you all is let's get government out of our coffee cups. Let's let ourselves drink polystyrene cups if we want to, and to those who don't want to, find an alternative somewhere else. But let's not get government in the picture and ban them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon. Mr. Solomon is a Brookline resident and Brookline business owner. Pardon? 5 minutes.
I am Jim Solomon. I am a Brookline resident, and I am the chef and owner of the Fireplace Restaurant. Thank you. Thank you. Sir, can I have that 20 seconds back? Yeah. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I apologize. I'm here today in my chef way. It's only because I'm in the middle of catering at Lars Anderson right now, but feel that this is an important enough issue. I ran over in the middle of a job. So I wanted to come and speak wearing the hat not of Senior Vice President for the Chamber of Commerce and not as a member of the Selectmen's Climate Action Committee. I'm here to speak as a business owner. I am pro-business, but I also believe that businesses have a corporate responsibility. And the Fireplace is the first certified green restaurant in Boston, and I have a lot of experience over the 8 years of our certification in finding alternative products. We take about 4 steps a year, becoming more and more ecologically responsible. And in my tremendous experience with finding a number of alternative products, I was able to stop using styrofoam 8 years ago when we immediately became a certified green restaurant. It took us a little while to find the right container, although it wasn't much more money with the immediate containers we went to. And by demanding of our suppliers and pushing them, we've been able to switch to biodegradable containers. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk tonight about paper taking up more room in landfills than styrofoam. And, you know, I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to tell you that I now use a biodegradable container instead of styrofoam. But I think that without pushing the suppliers and without town government encouraging the businesses and pointing the direction, I can tell you the suppliers won't move as quickly. The restaurants might be doing the research, and you know, and I applaud Dunkin' Donuts as a good Massachusetts company, but I just don't believe that they will move as quickly on their own as they will when you know, encouraged by the town, because they have to use something else. You know, I also believe that the cost argument for me has not been a significant impediment to my business. We've outlasted many businesses in the life cycle, the lifespan of many restaurants. We believe in looking at reducing costs, not just by one product, but rather we take a more comprehensive approach and believe that it's a combination of changing packaging, recycling, waste reduction, energy efficiency in the restaurant, and that all those combined cut costs. You know, we don't look just on one product. So if immediately something is a little more expensive, I don't think that needs to be a deterrent. You know, that sustainable alternatives take up less space in restaurant garbages, and the non-recyclable trash is the more expensive trash to haul away. You know, I do think that there is little question about the toxicity of polystyrene, and certainly styrene, but polystyrene. And I think there's
1 minute, sir.
Thank you. Also, little question about the effect on on ecology. And I think that, you know, there's a lot that's been written about microwaving polystyrene and the chemicals leaching into the food. I think many people microwave their coffees, and I think many people microwave in styrofoam containers. I didn't even know you couldn't until this week as I continue with my research. I think most restaurant businesses are not taking most restaurants and businesses are not taking voluntary steps, not pressing suppliers, and the community must point the direction, as I said. if you go to dinegreenbrookline.com, there's a website that I set up with the Green Restaurant Association. One click and it sends a button to, sends an email to over 50 restaurants in Brookline, encouraging them to be more ecologically responsible. I did that, and I mention it, thank you, only because I've not been able to get people to become more green by just having meetings. And in conclusion, I just want to say that the arguments I hear don't sound all that dissimilar against the warrant. It sound not all that dissimilar to those made by the Steamship Authority when Progress led to the locomotive. And I urge people to adopt the full warrant article. Thank you.
Ms. Daly.
Getting overexcited here. Nancy Daly, I broke with the rest of the Board of Selectmen, and I'm supporting Ms. Heller's warrant article. I noticed many years ago, it's at least 15 or more years ago now, when my son was playing soccer, that when there'd be a brief break, half the kids on the team would run over to get their asthma inhaler out. And that sort of made me very conscious about what I brought into my home and what was in our air around us, because it certainly wasn't like that when I was a child. And I think that, you know, when we throw things in our blue bin, but then they go off and get burned, that's not really what I think of as recycling. And I did not as much research as some of the other people, but I did notice that, and I do, as a result of, you know, my concerns and allergies in my families and whatever, I do try to buy organic meat whenever I can. And I've noticed more and more, so that's more expensive to begin with, but I've noticed more and more it coming in the sort of coated cardboard trays instead of the styrofoam. So that is possible and seems to be becoming more common. I also checked with the Washington Square Tavern, and they use the aluminum trays for takeout, but they were using number 6 lids, and I said, well, do you have any problem with switching to, you know, a cardboard lid or something like that? They said no problem. So that's not a wide sample size, but I also just looked on Restaurant Supply website, and I noticed, like a lot of times the Chinese food, when we get it from the takeout, the rice would come in the sort of folded cardboard thing, but they had gone to these number 6 containers for the food. But in the old days, the food came in the folded cardboard thing as well. And when you look on the restaurant supply sites, those folded cardboard boxes are cheaper, actually, than the plastic. So I think we can do this, and I would recommend favorable action on Ms. Heller's warrant article.
Mr. Weitzman. We'll hear from Mr. Weitzman first.
Don Weitzman, Precinct 12. I was just wondering if Dr. Balsam is still here, whether he could enlighten us on any of the health effects of styrene versus polystyrene, and whether there is any public health concern vis-a-vis the various options that we're facing. Thank you.
Dr. Balsam.
Hi, Alan Balsam, Director of Public Health and Human Services for the town. We did an extensive review looking at this issue of the effect on public health. It's interesting because everybody is telling the truth here tonight. Styrene is nasty and does pose a risk to workers who work with it because they're exposed both dermally and through the respiratory route. At the same time, styrene, when in the environment, for example, in cigarette smoke, which is the way most people are exposed to it, so they take it in their respiratory system, that also poses a public health threat. Polystyrene, on the other hand, people get exposed to that through the oral route. So while it, and in doses much lower than otherwise people would be exposed, say, through cigarette smoke or as styrene. So then it is true the National Institute on Health has said that it's not a significant public health threat when taken in the oral route. It is true, though, that it does leach into foods when exposed to fat-soluble substances and hot beverages and in the microwave oven. And there is research going on now to ascertain to what extent that poses a threat. But at this time, I'm not prepared to say that there is a threat based on what I've seen in the literature. I just want to make two other points. One is that the Advisory Council on Public Health did not take a formal position on this, both for timing reasons and because while there are many other reasons to consider this ban, they didn't feel that public health was the issue that people should hang their hat on. But finally, their major concern was the additional burden that all of these issues, whether it's the issue of this ban or the plastic bag ban or the monitoring of kennels, which you'll deal with later, or doggy daycares, or the food truck issue, which we're charged with now, monitoring and regulating the winter's farmers market. So all of these issues, it's a lot, folks. And so if we're expected to do all this, especially in light of what's going on with public health statewide, I think it's prudent to realize that we're going to need some additional resources to do all of the things you're asking us to do. So I'll just let it sit there.
I believe the question's been called. Is there a second? Okay, I have Mr. Richmond and Mr. Lowe signed up to speak, each one of whom will speak in favor of the petitioner's motion.
I would be very brief and add something
Nope.
that hasn't been stated yet.
You can be heard if the motion to terminate debate fails to get a 2/3 vote, sir. All those in favor of
Mr. Moderator,
terminating
I'm going to request a recorded vote on this, if I could.
a recorded vote on a motion to...
Oh, no, sorry, when we get to it, I just wanted to
Well,
put you on notice, sorry.
You just hold your horses. On the motion to call the question to terminate debate, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion carries by a 2/3 vote. Now we have two amendments to deal with. I assume you don't need you are not asking for a recorded vote on the amendments, or are you?
No, I am.
You are?
I will ask for all recorded vote on all amendments.
It's Mr.
Clint Richmond, Precinct 6.
Mr. Richmond is getting his revenge for having been cut off, I guess. Okay, we will have a recorded vote on the advisory committee's motion to amend on the selectmen's motion to amend, and on the main motion if there are 35 town meeting members who request a recorded vote. And there are. So, this is entitled Article 8 AC Amendment. The Advisory Committee amendment is on page 5 of the green sheet and would add a sentence to the first paragraph of the main motion that this provision shall not apply to the packaging of uncooked meat, uncooked poultry, and/or uncooked fish. If you support that amendment, when it comes time to do so, you will hit 1 on your handheld device. If you're opposed to that amendment, you'll hit 2. And if you abstain, you'll push 3. We're ready for the voting period. Okay, you can now vote. Again, we're voting on the Advisory Committee amendment on page 5 of the green sheets. The motion fails by a vote of 92 in favor, 111 against, and 6 abstentions. We next turn to the Board of Selectmen's proposal on page 2 of the Green Supplement to add after the words effective December 1, 2013 polystyrene, add the words foam, paren expanded or quote blown polystyrene, close quotes. And I take it we can take both of these amendments together. I mean, they're codependent, are they not? And to add the word foam before containers in the third line of the second paragraph. If you vote in favor of it, you are
Mr.
voting
Moderator.
in favor of these amendments to the main motion. And you'll push 1. If you are opposed, you'll press 2, and abstain, press 3. We're ready for the...
Mr. Moderator, we're going to have a recorded vote on that as well, please.
Yes,
Clint
you're
Richmond.
having a recorded vote, Mr. Richmond. My goodness. This is Article 8 BOS amendment. B for boy, B for board. Okay, the voting period is commenced. Sort of exciting, isn't it? The motion fails by a vote of 66 in favor, 139 against, and 6 abstentions. On the, this is Article 8 main motion. On the motion on page 8-1 with no amendments is what we're voting on. So if you're in favor of that motion, you'll hit 1. If you're against it, you'll press 2. And you can join the town clerk and the moderator in abstaining by hitting 3. Anytime. Okay, the voting period is commenced. Motion carries by a vote of 169 in favor, 27 against, and 11 abstentions. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to Article 9, and I think we will spend as much time on Article 9 as we did on Article 8, judging from the number of speakers. So I would suggest that for the balance of our time, we move along to Article 10 and perhaps Article 11 to see if we can dispose of those arguments, articles. It takes a a motion of town meeting to defer consideration of Article 9 until first thing tomorrow evening. Would someone like to make that motion? Is there a second? Those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, no. Motion carries. Article 10. The motion under Article 10 is found on page 10-4. Moved. Could we have quiet, please? Moved by Mr. Benka, seconded by Mr. Spiegel, that the town amend Section 4.07 of the zoning bylaw by adding a new use relating to domestic household animal daycare centers. Mr. Benka. Once again, don't forget to turn in your handheld devices when you leave the auditorium. Mr. Benka, sorry.
Thank you. Dick Benka for unanimous Board of Selectmen. Article 10 is designed to respond directly to a growing trend in the town: animal daycare facilities that are not connected to a veterinarian's office. The bylaw would allow such businesses in business districts, but only by special permit. Explicit controls would be in place prior to the grant of a special permit. There would be no overnight kenneling. There would have to be studies verifying protections against noise, odor, and waste disposal. And the Director of Public Health would be required to pre-approve the location and make a recommendation. Moreover, there would be ongoing monitoring because an annual license would be required, with the recommendation of the Director of Public Health, the police, and the Director of Parks and Open Space about the actual responsible operation of the facility over time. Currently, no such explicit controls exist, and the Board unanimously recommends favorable action on the proposed zoning change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zerillo.
Thank you. Mark Zerillo, Chairman of the Planning Board for the Planning Board. The Planning Board supports this amendment. While the zoning bylaw was formulated in the 1960s, this type of use wasn't contemplated. And more requests for animal daycare facilities are likely in the future because of the current demand for this use. With annual licensing and oversight of the relevant departments, adequate controls to regulate and oversee these facilities will be in place. Therefore, the Planning Board unanimously recommends favorable action on Article 10. Thank you.
Mr. Spiegel, would you like to add anything? Well, there are several reasons I can think of. Mr. Spiegel wanted to know why not.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. It's Stanley Spiegel from Precinct 2. You'll recall last year there was an article at the town meeting on doggy daycare. It needed fixing. However, by doing some spade work and incorporating some relevant pointers, we've been able to vet it and whip it into shape. So now we can shepherd this pet project through to passage. There will be suitable conditions imposed during the licensing procedure. For example, to recapture any dogs that might run free, daycare facilities can be required to employ some husky retrievers. Now, in case anyone wonders why the Directors of Park and Open Space is mentioned in the licensing procedure, it turns out that if too many dogs are walking near town trees, this is true, the trees can be harmed. This is especially true of dogwoods. And if the dog happens to be a Shih Tzu, you have to be careful how you pronounce that, actually. Now, admittedly, the relationship between dogs and trees has been well established, which is why every year town meeting votes for measures of wood and bark. In any case, the advisory committee strongly urges approval of this article. Some folks beg to differ. We haven't exactly been hounded by dog owners, and some may think it's much ado about nothing, but we think it's the least we can do, and we hope you all will concur. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I withdraw my objection, Mr. Spiegel. On the motion on
Question,
page...
Mr. Moderator? Question?
Yes, Mr. Owens.
Andrew Owens, Precinct 5. It's difficult to follow Stanley, of course, but I have a sane question here, I think. Given Alan Balson's position of the need to probably beef up his department, I wonder if a application fee or permit fees are to be considered when somebody wants to set one of these things up. I really think this should be feed at the front end in order to reimburse the town for the regulatory.
I respect your feelings in that important subject, but it's not before us.
It was purely a question.
On the motion on page 10-4, this requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion carries by a 2/3 vote. Article 11. The motion under Article 11 is found on page 11-5. Move that the town amend Article 9 relating to administrative review for daycare centers. Moved by Ms. Hyatt, seconded by Mr. Goldstein. Ms. Hyatt. Your maiden voyage, I believe?
Maiden voyage, and I'm no Stanley, that's for sure. My name is Angela Hyatt, Precinct 5, and I'm speaking for a unanimous advisory committee. Article 11 has been submitted by the Department of Planning and Community Development at the recommendation of the Zoning Bylaw Committee. The purpose of this article is to bring our zoning bylaw into conformance, essentially, with the Mass General laws, at least as an interim measure. You see, under Brookline's current zoning bylaws, daycare centers are allowed by right in business and industrial districts, but are actually prohibited in single-family districts and allowed only by special permit in all other residential districts, which puts our bylaw in conflict with the Mass General Laws 40A, Section 3, which states that although some dimensional and parking regulations are allowed, a child care facility use can neither be prohibited outright nor require a special permit. While more far-reaching changes will ultimately be required to bring our zoning bylaw for this use into full compliance with the state statute, the Planning Department has proposed the creation of a new section, Section 912, Administrative Review for Daycare Centers, as an interim measure and until reasonable dimensional and parking requirements can be formulated. The administrative review proposed in Article 11 is essentially a mechanism to solicit feedback from the various town departments, similar to that used for Dover Amendment projects in residential districts. The applicant would be required to submit information such as hours of operation, the number of employees, the number of children enrolled, as well as whether they have their own outdoor play space or plan to use a public park, and perhaps one of the biggest potential impacts on neighbors, what they plan to do about parking, drop-off, and pickup. This will then be distributed to the various town departments and solicit review and suggestions for improvements. The advisory committee feels that the multidisciplinary aspect of the administrative review proposed under Article 11 will be a very valuable tool to mitigate the potential impact of these projects, particularly in residential neighborhoods where their use has previously been, and erroneously apparently, prohibited or restricted. Because the recommendations are advisory in nature, there is no conflict with Mass General laws. So by unanimous vote of 24-0, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on Article 11.
Thank you, Mr. Zerillo.
Mark Zerillo, Chairman of the Planning Board for the Planning Board. The The board believes that before significant changes to the zoning bylaw related to child care facilities are made, that the planning department believes that this is important to have an opportunity to formulate reasonable dimensional and parking requirements. The statute allows municipalities to regulate bulk and height of structures, yard setbacks, lot area, open space, and parking in order to protect neighborhoods. The language in the state statute for child care centers is very similar to that for religious and nonprofit educational centers. Administrative review has worked well with educational and religious institutions, and the planning board believes the same would hold true for child care facilities. Prior applicants have often been appreciative for suggestions about operating characteristics, some of which would never have been considered by them until they came before the board. Often, where practical, the recommendations have been adopted, especially ones that relate to safety issues. Therefore, the planning board recommends unanimous approval of Article 11. Thank you.
Mr. Goldstein?
Hi again, Ken Goldstein for unanimous Board of Selectmen. So Article 11 is a stopgap measure, a pacifier, if you will, Stanley. Our current zoning bylaw prohibits daycare uses in single-family districts and requires special permits in other residential districts. Recently, thanks to Building Commissioner Bennett, it was realized that Section 40A of Mass General Law, Section 3, prohibits our prohibition and does not permit our special permits. We are allowed to regulate certain aspects of these uses, including parking, and most importantly parking, I should say, but the proper limits of our regulatory authority have not yet been determined. Our bylaw needs to be changed. Some study, careful consideration, and careful drafting needs to be completed. In the meantime, the Department of Planning and Community Development wants to assure that at minimum the town has the opportunity to review and provide input for proposed daycare uses in residential zones. Following the model of the zoning bylaw 9.11, the warrant article creates an administrative review process. Section 912 of the bylaw for new daycare facilities would require applicants to submit plans for review by the planning, building, transportation, public health, and parks and open space departments. These departments would have a 14-day period in which to make suggestions for improvement. No building permit would issue until the period expires. While the administration suggested improvements would not be requirements, the town's experience with the analogous Section 9.11 for educational uses in residential zones has been generally positive. The suggestions have been appreciated and, for the most part, accepted by the applicants. A more comprehensive zoning bylaw revision for daycare can be anticipated in the future. Until then, unanimous Board of Selectmen urges favorable action on warrant Article 11. Thank you.
On the motion on page 11-5 requiring a 2/3 vote, all those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. The motion has been made to adjourn town meeting until 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. Is there a second? All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries. Don't forget to turn in your handheld devices. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.